The chamber breathes like a furnace even before the torches are lowered to their iron brackets. Heat slicks the stone, smoke files itself into the ceiling ribs and hangs there a sooty halo above a room designed to make sound ricochet back upon itself. The boy is already on the platform, bare shivering, trying to stand inside his own stillness, as attendants lift jars the colour of late afternoon. When they tip the first one, honey unfurls in a slow viscous ribbon. It hesitates at his shoulder, then commits sliding down collarbone and chest, pooling in the hollows of elbows and knees. 10 jars become a lacquer, every edge of him gilded to the ankles. The torchlight finds this sheen and multiplies it. The boy is turned into a statue that sweats sweetness. He has been trained for this. The posture, the silence, the stubborn refusal to beg. His throat works once, twice and stops, but the eyes refuse instruction. They stare past the sconces, past the attendants, past the platform's guttered channels that wait for what the room always makes, and they lodge on the door in the rear wall a slab of black cedar framed with bronze pegs. When that door moves even a finger's width, the air down here changes. You can feel the shift like a hand on the skin. The door does more than open, it permits. From the cedar threshold step, the servants who carry small clay containers sealed with woven palm. They do not speak. They place the vessels in a semicircle around the stone 3 in lion's mouth paint, one unmarked in the corner like an omission pretending not to matter. The boy hears it before he sees it, the minute stutter of thousands of legs against ceramic, the papery anger of wings. Sound is the first cruelty. It tells him what is coming and gives him time to imagine it. A figure is borne in on a litter, an old man underneath a garment that gleams like sand after rain. He cannot cross the room without help, but indifference travels faster than the human body. His gaze reaches long before he does. The attendants lower him to a throne raised slightly above the platform, an angle chosen for vantage. Some say 96 years have taken him this far, others a century. They say he has ruled since the age when children are still taught to keep their hands out of fire. They say he forgets nothing. Whether these accounts are true or curated matters less than the room's certainty. This is the one for whom the jars were warmed, the creatures starved, the walls thickened. He lifts one finger. The first lid is loosened. Black shells spill like coins. Scarabs, hungry long enough to confuse hunger, with permission, find the honey and become a living quorum that swarms across the boy's shoulders and ribs. Mandibles taste sweetness, then skin, then the seam where the two meet. His muscles try to hold the script he memorized, but small betrayals register the flutter behind the jaw. The knees half bend, breath, shortened to fit inside the space pain allows. Below the throne, a scribe notes the time with a reed pen. Everything here has a number. The second container releases its Red River fire ants a name that is less metaphor than measurement. They travel in columns as if obeying grammar laid into the honey with the attendants' brushes. Wherever the sugar threads they follow, and wherever the skin thinnies, wrists in steps the tender cup beneath the arm, they gather like commas, pausing then resuming with venom that writes in heat. A third container opens, and the room adds sound to heat wasps aggravated into a quarrel, with the very air strike the face that was a boy's moments ago and is now swelling toward anonymity. It happens quickly and it happens long. The body learns the difference. On the dais, the old man leans forward with the posture of anyone whose hearing has grown narrow at the edges. He does not flinch. Occasionally he lifts the same finger and the attendants adjust. More honey on the feet, he means, where nerves braid so close to the skin, a breath can become a blade. Fewer wasps on the right side, let the beetles concentrate where softness yields. The gestures are minimal, curt practiced. The control is entire. What occurs in this room does not arise from a storm of impulses. It is composed. If you listen past the noise, you hear a different order moving beneath it, the steps built into the ritual like the joints inside a hand. The chamber was sealed with bitumen to keep the sound from corrupting the palace above, but also to hold the scream in place so it can be studied. The platform's grooves drain what bodies cannot keep. The drugs in the wooden cup on the shelf are neither balm nor mercy. They send the mind back to the surface each time it tries to dive into unconsciousness. Even the time of day is chosen because some species wake to dusk as if it were a summons from their god. Pain here is not an accident born of anger. Pain is the curriculum. This scene is not performed once and forgotten. It has variations the way a song does. Some evenings, the unmarked vessel in the corner is opened. It's secrecy, not a surprise by this point, but a promise that the threshold of what a room can do is always farther out than it looked. Some nights the ritual stops just before the body breaks. and nurses move in with poultices, with measured sips, with the gentle arithmetic of repair, not to heal, to reset the clock so the sequence can be repeated and recorded. Expense is a kind of ethics here, the living cost more. The attendants speak to one another in numbers, ages, weights, intervals. They calibrate the room the way shipwrights tune a keel. The boy survives. This is its own sentence. He will be led away through a door that refuses to echo footsteps down a corridor where even lamps burn quietly into a ward where physicians know how to subtract fever without subtracting memory. He will be fed broth meant for the sick and wine meant for the nervous system. Salves will cool what can be cooled. He will sleep. He will wake twice thinking it was a dream, a third time knowing it was not. Weeks from now, when his skin has become a map of where the room has been, he will return. The cycle is not a circle because it does not bring one back to the start. It tightens. Across the chamber the old man watches until his eyes decide the hour has given him enough. If there is delight, it never rises to the face. If there is boredom, it does not either. What is visible is a concentration that looks like hunger, wearing the clothes of curiosity. Occasionally he murmurs to the scribe, the reed moves, the record grows. Nothing here is only spectacle. At least that is what they tell themselves, the priests who bless the creatures, the officials who draft inventories for jars and reeds and palm rope, the guards who slow their pace before the cedar door without admitting to themselves that they are slowing. They tell themselves it is ritual, therefore order, therefore not chaos. Language is part of the machinery. Outside this room an entire geography of service has sprung up to support what happens underground. In the districts beyond the river, flowers that should have been crimes of beauty are cultivated for their sugar and scent. Beekeepers learn to offer sweetness to the crown as if it were tax, not harvest. Potters sell lidded jars with flanges designed for hands that tremble. Boatmen move crates that do not rattle. A city that should be ruled by calendars of flood and planting adds a second calendar ruled by appetite. Every bureaucracy needs a story about itself. Here it is that the gods demand a kind of theatre that only a state can stage. There are people who refuse to be part of this. Some go to the desert, some pretend not to hear, some pray with a violence that looks like argument. But the ritual continues because it is not only an act, it is an arrangement of acts, a schedule, a payroll, a paper trail written on papyrus that will later be burned, but first must exist. Cruelty made well enough wears the mask of necessity. It can be budgeted. You stand far back if we can say you for the one who looks and cannot intervene. Maybe you are a guard new enough that your knuckles still remember the training yard. Maybe you are a scribe who thought history was lists until you discovered how lists can be used. Maybe you are merely someone who hears through stone and draws conclusions in the dark. Whoever you are, the room teaches you something you do not wish to learn, that when harm is repeated with the same steps it becomes liturgy, that when enough hands are assigned one small task no one feels the weight of the whole, that entertainment can put on a priest's robe and be called holy long enough for people to forget the difference. The old man lifts his finger for the last time tonight. The attendants step in like punctuation at the end of a line. The lids are refastened, the black cedar closes, the torches are unhooked and taken away. Smoke keeps its halo a moment longer and then thins. The chamber returns to its first breath. This is where we begin because beginnings explain endings. In this room beneath Memphis, we see the pattern that will leave marks far from the stone sweetness harvested into instruments living. Things repurposed into tools, a nation organized around appetite and silence engineered as carefully as sound. The ritual pretends to be worship. The audience pretends to be absolution. In the space between those pretenses, the blueprint reveals itself not a single crime, but a structure cruelty rendered orderly, codified, efficient. Atrocity dressed as right. Spectatorship disciplined into policy. It will break the boy. It will break the country. But for now the door is shut, the ink is fresh and the room is satisfied with what it has learned. The year was 2278 BC, and the palace at Memphis woke to mourning that no one believed. The priest said the king had died from a scorpion's sting. Courtiers repeated it dutifully, lowering their eyes, crossing their arms over linen chests, performing grief with the precision of ritual. But even the servants in the outer kitchens knew that scorpions did not slip through 14 guards, 2 sealed doors and a food taster's chamber to deliver a single bite the width of a bronze dagger. The rumour reached the streets before the body cooled. Pepi. I had not been stung. He had been shenanigans. 3 days later another death, the crown prince strong and healthy, supposedly taken by river fever, while commanding a desert outpost 40 leagues from any river. 2 heirs gone in 1 week. The throne that should have passed smoothly down the bloodline now stood like an altar, waiting for the next sacrifice. Behind the veils of the women's quarters, courtiers whispered about the poisoned conspiracies and the ambitions of a queen mother whose influence had always unsettled the priests. Only one child remained of royal blood, Neferkara Pepi, 6 years old. A boy so distant from succession that no tutor had taught him diplomacy or cruelty, only the simple things: how to read the stars carved on temple ceilings, how to march wooden soldiers across a floor mosaic of the Nile. He followed his mother through corridors like a shadow. He asked permission to pet cats. He cried when pigeons were trapped for feasts. He was in every way a child. 7 days after the king's death, the same child that was stripped of his clothes, lifted above a golden basin, and drowned in blood to be reborn as a god. The coronation of Egypt was not gentle theatre. It was alchemy, the transformation of human into divine through fierce spectacle and sensory overwhelm. It began before dawn. Nobles gathered in a hall whose walls were lined with polished alabaster, so that the torches multiplied each reflection of the boy. A white bull, fattened on dates and grain for months, was led forward by attendants chanting hymns. Its throat was cut with surgical precision, the carotid opened to pour life directly into the basin, large enough to bathe a man. The blood steamed in the morning air. The priest lifted the boy and lowered him into the basin. He thrashed as every instinct screamed to breathe, but 4 pairs of hands held him under. The moment before drowning was the moment the ritual demanded: lungs burning, vision whitening, the fragile tether between life and death stretched thin enough to make room for a god. Then he was pulled up, dripping crimson, gasping, a small animal reborn into myth. Every coronation expected tears. Fear made the ritual convincing, terror humbled the flesh so that divinity could enter. But what came from Pepi's mouth was not crying, it was laughter. Clear, delighted, almost musical. The priests froze, mistaking it for madness until they saw his expression: fascination, not hysteria. He studied his blood-covered hands the way other children studied beetles, turned them in the light, then licked one finger to taste. The high priest veteran of 40 coronations wrote later in a private note that in all his life he had never felt so sudden a chill as when the child smiled through that mask of blood. The ritual had not ended. There remained the proof, the test of dominion, older than the pyramidization, meant to show that the divine spark could command life and death. A prisoner was brought forth, a minor thief, dragged from the dungeons for this purpose. His wrists were bound, his head forced to bow before the boy. A ceremonial blade of bronze was placed in Pepi's small hands, far too heavy, its hilt engraved with falcons and the Eye of Ra. "Remove the head," the high priest instructed softly. "Show that the god's power flows through you." The boy lifted the blade, wavered and swung. The edge missed entirely, crashing to the floor. Gasps rippled through the court. For an instant the illusion trembled. Perhaps the god was only a child after all. The boy steadied himself, lips pressed thin in concentration. He adjusted his feet as if remembering a lesson no one had taught him. The next blow struck the man's shoulder, opening a wound that spattered the front row of nobles. Another stroke followed, clumsy but improving. The prisoner moaned once. The boy did not pause. He swung again, learning the rhythm of bone and metal. By the 11th stroke, the head separated. Silence filled the hall, one of those silences that hum louder than noise. The priests waited for the child to cry or to collapse. Instead, he crouched beside the head, studying it as he might a puzzle, and whispered something. When the high priest dared to ask what he had said, Pepi answered with a serenity that did not belong to 6 years of life. "I asked it what death tastes like," he said. "It could not tell me. But I think I know. Death tastes like power. There are moments in history when the course of entire civilizations bends around the psychology of a single child. That morning was one of them." The boy stood amid the steam and the stench, a miniature sun at the centre of a system that would now orbit his will. The nobles saw not a trembling child, but a living proof that the gods had chosen continuity. The priests saw their doctrines validated in flesh. His mother saw something she could no longer protect. None realized they had just created a creature who believed mortality itself was a resource to be studied. He was wrapped in linen, crowned with the double diadem of Upper and Lower Egypt, and seated on a throne so large his feet dangled above the step. From that vantage he could barely see over the heads of his councillors, yet the hall bowed as one. Every adult there participated in the same quiet heresy they treated: play as divinity, curiosity as omnipotence, the untested mind of a child as the infallible voice of a god. Out in the courtyards the people cheered, When the bull's carcass was burned and incense filled the air, they saw smoke rising as a sign of renewal. Inside, the new pharaoh watched the flames without blinking. He was trying to see through the shimmer, whether death truly ended or only changed colour. By nightfall, the palace scribes began a new calendar, year 1 of Pepi II. The kingdom exhaled, believing succession, secure, order preserved. But within the sealed walls of the women's quarters, attendants whispered about what they had seen, a child laughing in a bath of blood, licking it from his hands like honey. In that image was the seed of everything that would follow a lesson misunderstood by its own teacher. A child who had been told he was a god now believed it. And when a god feels curiosity instead of guilt, the world around him becomes material for experiment. That night, while the torches burned low and the palace quieted, Pepi did not sleep. He lay awake, fingers tracing the dried flakes on his wrist where the blood had clung, wondering how something could be both sacred and sticky at once. He thought of the prisoner's eyes as the blade descended, how they had shifted from terror to emptiness, and he felt not horror but comprehension. In that understanding was the beginning of Egypt's longest reign and its darkest. The laughter of a 6-year-old had turned into policy. The gods had been satisfied, and the child had learned their appetite. Dawn broke pale over Memphis, but inside the palace the air smelled of roses and decay. 23 women stood before the throne, the late king's secondary wives, mothers and concubines, girls and widows who had once lived in silk but now trembled barefoot on cold stone. Tradition decreed that they would join their husband in the afterlife. Normally it was quick, a cup of opiated wine, a prayer to Hathor, and sleep that never ended. But the child on the throne had other ideas. The new pharaoh was 6. His feet didn't reach the dais. The double crown tilted slightly on his small skull, too heavy for the neck beneath it. Yet his gaze carried an intensity that silenced even the high priest. He had been baptized in blood the day before. Now he wished to see how life left the body not as symbol but as sequence. He ordered that no poison be used. Instead, silk cords were brought. The attendants hesitated, waiting for the priest to correct him. None did. They whispered that perhaps the god wished to witness his father's wives ascend slowly so he could learn the rhythm of departure. The cords looped around each woman's throat. The youngest, no more than 14, was still clutching the amulet her mother had given her for protection. The oldest was 32, mother of 3 of Pepi's half-brothers. When the guards began their work, the chamber filled with the muted percussion of struggle heels drumming air, rasping through collapsing throats, the wet hiccup between life and death. Pepi watched without flinching. Occasionally he gestured a child adjusting pieces on a game board. "Pause," he said once. The executioners froze mid-pull. "Let her breathe." The woman sagged, gasped, then the cords tightened again. He was studying something invisible, the exact point at which terror broke into surrender. To him it was not cruelty, but curiosity, a form of learning the priests had never named. It lasted 4 hours. When it ended, the hall smelled of sweat perfume and the faint sweetness of urine. The pharaoh's attendants moved through the bodies, checking for motion. Pepi's small hand reached out and touched one of the women's cheeks, still warm but cooling. He drew back his fingers, examined them, and whispered, "Death moves slowly. Like Thor." The scribe hesitated before writing it down, unsure whether it was blasphemy or revelation. Then came the children. 41 sons and daughters of the dead women royal by blood, potential threats by birth. The boys were dispatched quickly, the same cords doing their grim arithmetic. But the girls, his half-sisters, were told to choose. One by one they were brought before him, still smeared with the ashes of their mothers. They were made to kneel as the small god on the throne spoke in a voice almost gentle, "Serve me or join them." 6 chose servitude. The rest refused their courage, misinterpreted as defiance. They died beside their mothers. The 6 survivors were taken to a secluded wing of the palace, the women's quarters remade into something quieter, stranger, who would later be called the House of Brains. In that hidden wing, Pepi began his education. He would visit at odd hours, sometimes in daylight, more often at night, when the air was heavy and sounds carried. He never touched them. He simply watched how they breathed, how fear changed their posture, how they startled at footsteps that passed too close to the door. He asked questions, his tutors recorded. How long can the body tremble before exhaustion numbs it? When does crying become quiet? What colour are tears by the 3rd day without sleep? At first his tutors dismissed these questions as childish nightmares. But the pharaoh's will was now doctrine, and soon what had begun as morbid curiosity was formalized. Scribes invented new hieroglyphs for his research symbols that combined the signs for sight, pain, and truth. He called it the divine silence, the point where terror overwhelms speech, when the mind collapses into stillness. To him it was the closest a mortal could come to touching the gods. He instructed his priests to observe the same phenomenon during funerary rites, note the eyes of the dying, the final exhale, the moment when pleading turns to peace. Slowly across Egypt this obsession leaked from palace to temple. Silence became sacred. Stillness became a sign of favour. One of the surviving half-sisters years later would describe these visits. In a fragment preserved on an ostracon and found centuries after, she wrote, "He watched as if listening to music only he could hear. When we wept, he seemed relieved, as if the sound proved something he needed to know. But when we stopped, he smiled. He called that moment beautiful. By the time Pepi turned 8, priests spoke of him not merely as divine but as the witness, the one who could see fear and read its language. Rituals changed to include pauses for silence mimicking the stillness he demanded. In the temple hymns, the lines praising mercy grew shorter. The lines praising endurance grew long. From the outside, Egypt remained golden barges on the Nile, processions of priests' fields shimmering under the sun. But within the palace, a new kind of theology was taking root, one that equated suffering with revelation, terror with purity, death with understanding. What no one realized yet was that the child was not learning cruelty from others. He was teaching it to them. One night he summoned the high priest who had baptized him in blood. The old man entered trembling, believing he had failed some hidden duty, but Pepi only asked a question. "When the bull died, it looked at you before it fell. Did it see the gods or just you?" The priest hesitated, stammering prayers, but the pharaoh waved him silent. I think the boy murmured, "Fear opens the door between worlds. I only wish to look through." In that moment, the last traces of the child who had once cried over trapped pigeons disappeared. What remained was a being who mistook compassion for weakness, curiosity for holiness, and terror for truth. The lessons of fear had begun. They would never end. The papyrus fragments that survive from Pepi's early reign are fragile, brittle veins of brown ink stretched across reed fibre, but they reveal a mind already dissecting pain the way a scholar might diagram a star. The handwriting changes with age at 7 large and uncertain, at 10 confident slanting upward. Across the pages run the same obsessive heading, the great work of sensation. What began as observation had become classification. In those notes, pain was not a moral concept, but a spectrum, something that could be mapped, measured, tasted. Pepi divided it into families: fire-cutting poison, pressure, insect silence. He wrote that each form spoke a different dialect of the same language, that the gods had hidden knowledge in agony as they hid gold in sand. His tutors, terrified Reverend, or both, were ordered to assist in his research. They sourced poisons from the apothecaries of Thebes, resins from Nubia, herbs from the oases. The court physician, once a healer, now became curator of experiments designed not to cure, but to observe. At first Pepi tested on small things. Frogs, snakes, pigeons. He learned which toxins froze the muscles but left the eyes awake, which ones shut the lungs before the mind, which reversed the order. He called it the study of thresholds. Sometimes he would stay up all night writing meticulous notes on a breathing rate, skin colour, the moment the heartbeat became whisper. He would ask his tutors to recite poetry while the creatures suffered to see whether rhythm shortened endurance. None dared refuse. By 9 he had turned his attention to people. Prisoners first, then servants accused of negligence. The doses were small, the purpose observational. Consciousness, he wrote, is the bridge between worlds. The gods cross it slowly, we must learn the steps. He learned to calculate dosage like a craftsman calculating angles. Too much and the victim died too soon. Too little, and panic destroyed the data. He preferred paralysis that preserved awareness, the body motionless, the mind awake inside. The priests began to call such states holy stasis. But Pepi's fascination was not sadism in its simplest form. It was an intellectual hunger stripped of empathy. To him, the scream was not a plea but an instrument. He believed each type of pain had its own timbre, its own resonance, a hidden geometry. His scribes were forced to document the pitch of each cry, to measure the intervals between inhalations. He began assigning colours to sensations, burning red for heat, blue for freezing pain, white for poison-induced numbness. The charts filled scroll after scroll. The palace started to absorb this new theology of suffering. Where previous kings had sponsored art, Pepi sponsored observation. The workshops that once made jewellery now produced tiny bronze instruments for puncture, incision, compression. The line between temple ritual and experiment blurred, until both were the same act, the pursuit of divine truth through endurance. The story that reveals him best did not occur in the honey chambers, but in the daylight of the throne room. Pepi was 10. He sat for morning court surrounded by ministers, scribes and military envoys. Reports awaited his seal warnings of a minor famine in Upper Egypt, border raids in the south, petitions from temple builders begging for grain. But before the business could begin, a cat darted across the hall. It chased a bird that had slipped in through the open shutters. The chase ended beneath the golden throne. The cat caught the bird and broke its wing. The bird did not die. It fluttered one side, beating helplessly, dragging itself in a slow circle. The cat played, releasing and recapturing, drawing out the struggle. The courtiers shifted uncomfortably. The priests murmured that it was an omen, perhaps of chaos defeated by order. But Pepi raised his hand and everyone fell silent. He watched. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The scribes froze mid-script. The ministers stared at the floor, afraid to move, afraid to interrupt whatever sacred observation the young pharaoh was conducting. The bird continued to struggle, each flap weaker than the last. The cat paused, occasionally licking its paws, then began again. The silence grew so thick that even the sound of breathing felt profane. Outside, servants paused in their errands, sensing something happening. Within, time itself bent around the child's attention. The empire for that hour belonged to the fluttering on the marble floor. When the bird finally collapsed, Pepi exhaled a soft, satisfied sound, almost relief. He turned to his attendants and said, "That is truth. Death is not a moment, it is a process." Then, as if awakening from a trance, he ordered the famine reports read aloud. But none of the assembled men could focus. Their eyes kept straying to the tiny smear of feathers beneath the throne. Later, one official perhaps foolishly suggested resuming court business while the bird still twitched. Pepi's expression didn't change. He merely gestured to his guards. The man was beaten until he lost consciousness. The decree afterward was simple. To interrupt the divine gaze is blasphemy. From that day forward, when the pharaoh watched, no one else breathed loudly. The event entered legend. Temple singers turned it into a hymn praising the god-king's discernment of the mysteries of stillness. Children were taught that the pharaoh's eyes could see the soul leaving the body, and to meet his gaze during those moments was to glimpse the gods. The priests wove theological justification around the incident. They said the cat symbolized order, the bird chaos, and Pepi's calm observation represented Ma'at, the balance of the universe. They did not admit the truth that a child's curiosity had frozen an empire. Pepi himself added the episode to his notebooks. He described the progression of the bird's struggle as an elegant descent from motion to stillness, and noted how fear gradually distilled into resignation. He concluded, "There are flavours of suffering as there are flavours of wine. Some burn, some freeze, some linger in the mouth long after the body is gone." By 12, he had refined the taxonomy further. He discovered that different forms of pain required different surroundings. Heat for anger, cold for despair, darkness for confusion. He began designing chambers tuned to those effects, experimenting with echo temperature and scent. Pain was now architecture. The courtiers called these fascination divine. The priests called them revelation. Only the servants whispered the truth that the boy who had once laughed in blood now ruled not as king but as spectator. The empire had become his theatre, and silence was the ticket price. Egypt had seen tyrants before, but never a child who made stillness sacred and curiosity lethal. The kingdom had entered a new calendar not measured in harvests or floods, but in the intervals between screams. For if every agony had flavour, Pepi intended to taste them all. The letter that survives, copied by scribes, preserved on limestone and later buried with a general who had served 3 generations of pharaohs, seems at first glance unremarkable. It is written in the formal hand of the 6th dynasty, courteous in tone, rich in the perfumed language of obedience. Yet line by line the illusion cracks. Behind the pleasantries lies a child's mind sharpened by divinity and stripped of restraint. It begins simply to my faithful Harkuf, who carries the will of the throne upon his back. Harkuf was a veteran commander and the diplomat dispatched deep into Nubia to retrieve curiosities for the young god-king, gold incense, rare stones, and most famously a pygmy dancer whose agile body was said to move like a flickering flame. In most histories, this letter is presented as a charming relic, a boy king delighting in exotic gifts. But closer reading reveals something colder, a document that could be mistaken for a field manual in the management of sentient cargo. Pepi's tone is meticulous, almost tender, but every sentence coils with threat. He writes, "You shall guard him as you guard your own breath. Let him rest under shade, drink pure water, and be checked 10 times each night. Every watch of the moon a report shall be written to prove he lives. If he dies, you will die with him. If he is injured, your body shall mirror his injury tenfold. If he escapes, your sons shall be food for crocodiles." The cruelty here is procedural, not passionate. Pepi's words read less like a child's outburst than a systematized protocol, a contract designed to calibrate obedience through fear. Harkuf's journey from the south became not a military expedition but an experiment in logistics under divine scrutiny. In the margins of the surviving copy, a later scribe added, "These were the orders of the god when he was still young." The phrase carries both awe and apology. Then comes the most chilling passage usually omitted in sanitized translations. "Bring also another child equal in weight and height to the dwarf but ordinary. I wish to compare them. One shall be fed honey, the other water. One shall rest in shade, the other in sun. Let us see which breath lasts longer, and whether smallness alters the endurance of pain." Here curiosity masquerades as inquiry but bleeds into obsession. Pepi was not collecting entertainers, he was gathering data points. To him, the human body was not sacred but material and instrument to test hypotheses about suffering and survival. The dwarfs and the children became paired variables, controls and subjects in a divine experiment. What horrifies modern readers is how perfectly the letter foreshadows the bureaucracy that would later consume Egypt. Pepi's instructions map a chain of command complete with verification intervals, penalty clauses and quality checks. He transformed cruelty into paperwork long before it became a machine. His generals understood. To serve Pepi was to submit to precision. The logistics of the Nubian expedition expanded into an early form of empire-wide data collection. Harkuf's men recorded water rations, heart rates, body temperatures, and even vocal responses to exhaustion. Each entry was meant to please a boy king who saw in numbers the language of the gods. And Pepi waited. He followed the journey through weekly reports delivered by couriers who risked their lives to cross the desert. Each tablet fed his imagination. He underlined the figures, made notes in the margins, asked follow-up questions that revealed what truly interested him. Did the dwarf's pulse quicken faster in fear or heat? Was his sweat sweeter to insects? Do smaller bones break more easily or more cleanly? No question was rhetorical. Pepi saw in every answer a formula, in every human body a variable. When Harkuf finally returned, the procession was unlike any Memphis had seen. Trumpets announced his arrival. Dancers spread petals before the caravan. The pygmy was presented before the throne, still alive, trembling, painted in gold dust for spectacle. Pepi clapped his hands in delight, but witnesses noticed something strange. He did not look at the man's face. His eyes travelled instead over the proportions of limb and torso, as if measuring invisible lines. The ordinary child, his control subject, was brought forward next. Both were weighed, examined, their arms stretched to compare reach. The court chroniclers tried to describe it as a celebration, a living symbol of the empire's reach. But one attendant in a rare private note found centuries later recorded what others dared not. He smiled, not like a boy meeting a gift, but like a scholar finding proof. When the dwarf stumbled, his majesty clapped once and said, "See how the gods build variety into their clay." Then he ordered both measured again. That night the experiments began. The two were placed in separate chambers, one cool and perfumed, the other sweltering. Servants documented their breathing each hour, their reactions to heat, their endurance of thirst. The records show that the ordinary child survived 3 days, the dwarf 5. Pepi's notes beside the report are clinical, smaller vessels, slower exhaustion. Fear greater in both on day 2. Conclude, size affects duration, not intensity. To the court, it was another demonstration of divine curiosity. To history, it marks the point where the boundaries between life and data disappeared. The pharaoh's court became a living laboratory, its priests analysts of agony, its generals collectors of specimens. The letter to Harkuf thus stands as the first document in human history where logistics, science and theology merge into atrocity. Its tone is not ranting but reasoned, its cruelty not impulsive but procedural. Pepi had discovered that power need not shout. It could whisper through ink sealed with the royal cartouche, travelling hundreds of miles to command obedience through terror and curiosity intertwined. What began as a letter ended as doctrine, and a god demanding evidence, and from that moment forward, Egypt ceased to be ruled by a boy who enjoyed watching pain. It was ruled by a mind that sought to understand it, categorize it, and sanctify it. The difference was subtle and far more dangerous, because curiosity, when blessed by divinity, never stops asking questions. It began with the blessings. In the early years of Pepi's rule, the mothers of Memphis considered it an honor to have their sons brought before the divine child king. Once a month, families were summoned to the palace to offer their children for what the priests called the touch of the god. The ritual was simple. The pharaoh would lay his small hand upon each boy's head, murmur a prayer of vitality, and send them home bearing a mark of favor, a blue bead on a cord, a token of divine attention. But soon something began to change. Some of the boys returned pale, trembling, or with wounds they could not explain. Others did not return at all. The priests told their families that the boys had been chosen for higher service and honor beyond mortal comprehension. They spoke of divine mysteries of children too sacred for the world. Mothers wept with pride and fear, fathers bowed their heads in confused gratitude. Inside the palace, the truth was simpler and far darker. The blessings had become experiments. Pepi had grown impatient with observation alone. His notebooks were full of diagrams and theories, but what he desired now was verification. Watching others suffer no longer satisfied him. He wanted to feel the process of transformation the instant when life flickered and went out. He began small in private. Servants' children were brought to his chambers as companions. They were told to play, to dance, to sing hymns. When one fell or scraped a knee, Pepi noticed how fear widened the eyes, how the pupils trembled before tears began. He called that the opening. Then he began to induce it deliberately. A dropped ember brushed against a child's hand, a tightened rope by accident. A whip crack meant to test how quickly blood surfaced. Each event was recorded, measured, logged. His attendants learned not to question, only to note duration and response. The first public incident that history could not fully erase happened when Pepi was 24. The son of a noble family, 13 years old, newly appointed to the palace choir, was summoned for a private audience. 3 days later, his body was returned to his family, wrapped in linen, the priest bearing a sealed decree the boy had ascended in divine ecstasy. But when the family unwrapped the shroud, they found injuries so grotesque that the chief embalmer refused to prepare the corpse. He claimed the life force had been torn beyond repair. The family protested. They were wealthy, connected, impossible to silence. For a brief moment, the empire trembled on the edge of scandal. Then Pepi did something extraordinary and terrible. He turned outrage into theology. He summoned the family to the palace and spoke to them with the calm of a priest giving sermon. Their son, he said, had not been harmed. He had been chosen. His suffering was not punishment, but revelation, a path to sacred transformation. The pain had opened gateways between worlds. The boy had glimpsed what mortals were not meant to see. He touched the divine fire, Pepi said, and fire does not destroy the pure, it refines it. The family left that day not as accusers, but as mourners of a saint. They were given gifts of land and gold, their household elevated to guardians of the divine experiment. The boy's death became miracle, cruelty became sacrament. From that moment, Pepi understood something profound. If pain could be redefined as holiness, then no act was too monstrous to sanctify. He no longer needed to hide his appetites. He only needed the right language. So he built an institution to give that language structure. He called it the Overseer of Royal Entertainments. Officially, it was a ceremonial title responsible for arranging festivals, spectacles, and court amusements. In truth, it was a procurement system for living subjects. The first overseer was a man named Keti, a former tax official known for his efficiency and his lack of conscience. Within months, Keti had created a network that stretched from the Delta to Nubia. He divided Egypt into 4 regions, each governed by a director of delights, who in turn commanded 10 provincial scouts. Every scout managed 5 village agents responsible for selecting suitable children. The requirements were absurdly specific: boys between 8 and 14, healthy, symmetrical, unscarred, and most chillingly of pleasant voice. Pepi preferred high pitches, easier for his aging ears to distinguish when raised in screams. Each child's record was written on papyrus height, weight, skin tone, tone of cry. Those who met criteria were transported in sealed boats hidden beneath loads of papyrus or grain. Local priests provided false documentation declaring the children apprentices, temple servants, or bearers of offerings. What had begun as curiosity had become bureaucracy. Within the palace, the overseer's office expanded rapidly. Scribes documented every stage of selection. Physicians examined the arrivals for disease, noting which wounds healed fastest and which left the most interesting scars. Courtiers handled logistics, food, housing, disposal. The machinery of horror now operated with the precision of an irrigation system. And Pepi from his throne read the reports like a scholar reviewing sacred texts. He marked margins with comments, too swift, prolonged, processed, or more observation before death. He began classifying not only pain but endurance, creating rankings of fortitude that would later be used to select subjects for the honey chambers. The empire adjusted around him. Farmers learned that offering their sons could protect their harvests. Priests preached that divine suffering purified Egypt's soul. The river carried silence from village to village like a tax. It was around this time that the phrase "the games of the god" appeared in temple hymns. No one dared ask what it meant. When the first overseer died, some said from guilt, others from disfavour. Pepi replaced him immediately. The title became hereditary, passing from father to son, ensuring continuity. With each generation of bureaucrats, the distance between act and empathy widened. No one in the chain needed to see the outcome. Their duty ended with the next signature. In this way, Pepi achieved what no ruler before him had he industrialized obedience. Pain became paperwork. Terror became routine. In later centuries, historians would struggle to understand how an entire civilization participated in such madness. The answer lies here in the invention of the overseer of royal entertainments, a title so absurdly benign it concealed the birth of systemic atrocity. Pepi no longer needed to stain his own hands. The empire would do it for him. The child who once laughed in blood had grown into a god who ruled through silence. And with every boy taken from his village, with every mother who learned to pray without expecting an answer, Egypt itself was being remade not by conquest but by administration. Watching had become doing, and doing had become the law. Egypt's empire of faith had always depended on order, grain tallied by cubit taxes, weighed in daemon prayers recited in rhythm. Pepi merely redirected that same machinery toward appetite. Once the overseer of royal entertainments took root, cruelty shed the need for secrecy. It became a system self-feeding and self-justifying. The empire's priests said it was the will of the divine child. The bureaucrats said it was simply their job. Between those two sentences, atrocity found its perfect home. From Thebes to Elephantine, scouts fanned out like harvesters. Each had quotas: 20 boys per month from populous districts, 10 from smaller nomes, 5 from desert oases. Their directives were etched on clay tablets for the precision once reserved for crop records. Failure meant impalement. Overperformance meant gold a house, or the right to keep one's own sons untouched. The hierarchy of horror operated exactly like commerce. Scouts worked in pairs, one to select, one to record. They carried measuring cords for height scales for weight, and thin reed flutes to test pitch. They would stand in the market pretending to buy figs and call a child over, under the pretext of measuring his voice for temple choir service. The notes they took read like inventory lists: age 9, height 1 cubit 6 palms, teeth complete, tone clear, high unbroken. When a choice was confirmed, the family was summoned to the local shrine and told their son had been noticed by the Yut. Most wept in gratitude, never realizing the truth until the caravan had vanished. Those caravans became a regular sight on the riverboats, painted with lotus symbols and guarded by soldiers who pretended to be temple escorts. Each carried between 20 and 50 children sealed below deck in darkness. They were given water, sometimes honeyed wine, not to comfort them but to preserve them. The routes were charted like arteries connecting remote villages to the central heart in Memphis. Scouts called them corridors of offering. At each stop a clerk awaited the shipments. These clerks were the empire's new priests, fluent not in prayer, but in record-keeping. They catalogued arrivals with meticulous care, assigning serial numbers, verifying conditions, issuing receipts. Even terror had receipts now. A well-run shipment could generate half a dozen copies of documentation, one for the palace, one for the regional archive, one for the temples that blessed the exchange. Bureaucracy did what it always does: it normalized the unthinkable. Medical handlers met the arrivals in the lower courtyards of the palace. They were healers by training, reduced to maintenance workers in a system that used flesh as material. They examined each boy for defects, recording bruises, scars, deformities. Those deemed imperfect were diverted, a word that meant disposal. The preferred method was silent suffocation with linen soaked in lotus oil. The bodies were taken through service tunnels to the Nile and released at night, the current doing the rest. The river that had once delivered life to Egypt now carried its shame downstream. Within the palace itself, the operation resembled an administrative office more than a dungeon. Scribes sat in neat rows beneath murals of the gods, cataloguing pain like merchants tallying goods. The air smelled of ink, parchment, and antiseptic herbs. Runners moved between rooms carrying slates marked with symbols, the bee for those destined for honey rituals, the serpent for venom, experiments, the flame for thermal endurance tests. Each mark represented not only a fate but a supply chain. The potters who made jars, the beekeepers who refined honey, the physicians who mixed tinctures to prolong survival. Every level of the system fed the one above. The scouts filled the quotas. The clerks confirmed delivery. The physicians ensured reusability. The priests blessed the chambers. The scribes archived results. And at the summit sat Pepi reading weekly summaries that turned horror into metrics. Average duration before paralysis 19 minutes. Mortality rate 72%, cost per subject 3 deben for Kyitu. He annotated the reports in his own hand, adding comments in the margin. Small adjustments that reveal both the precision of his intellect and the emptiness of his soul reduce venom exposure by 1 draft. Adjust honey ratio for higher insect response. Test with alternate salves to extend survivability. The handwriting is delicate, elegant, as though he were reviewing poems rather than torture procedures. What makes these records so chilling is their tone. No one shouts, no one curses, no one begs. The language is neutral, clerical, detached. A body is not a body but a subject. Death is not murder but cessation of function. Suffering is data variance. Even mercy has a form, subject archived early, no further observation required. And outside the palace life went on. Farmers sowed and harvested, unaware that the honey they produced no longer sweetened bread, but flesh. Potters shaped vessels without knowing what they would hold. River merchants ferried sealed crates without asking questions, and when they prayed at temples, the same priests who blessed their trade blessed the tortures beneath the palace. This is how evil matures not through passion, but through process. The overseer of royal entertainments had given Egypt something more enduring than terror he had given it structure. Soon the entire apparatus functioned with the efficiency of a living organism. A missed quota in one province would trigger penalties in another. Reports were cross-checked by multiple scribes to prevent falsification. Even corruption found its rhythm. Scouts sometimes falsified records to spare children, and when discovered they too were diverted. The machine consumed not only victims but those who hesitated. The phrase feeding the chambers entered bureaucratic slang. It appeared in ledgers beside allocations for temples, farms, and armies, as if the maintenance of atrocity was as routine as maintaining the irrigation canals. The men who ran the system no longer thought in moral terms, they thought in logistics quotas and efficiency. Occasionally a scribe's conscience would leak through the ink. One fragment found centuries later bears an unfinished line. "May the gods forgive us for..." It ends abruptly, the rest lost to water or fear. By Pepi's 30th year of rule, the cult of appetite had become indistinguishable from the state itself. To serve the throne was to serve the machinery. To question it was to risk becoming part of it. The ancient architects of the pyramids had once built stone monuments to eternity. Pepi's architects built something darker and more lasting, a system that required no belief in cruelty, only participation in it. And so Egypt marched forward, records, neat rivers, quiet priests, dutiful. A civilization convinced that as long as the numbers balanced, nothing was wrong. The machine had learned to feed itself, and its rhythm was perfect. The origin of the honey rites began as so many horrors do with an accident. One summer afternoon in the palace's southern granary, a labourer spilled a jar of honey while unloading supplies. The thick golden syrup oozed across the floor, spreading toward the shadows where ants and beetles nested. Within moments the room came alive. A swarm of insects erupted from the cracks, scarabs, ants, wasps drawn by the scent. The workers shouted, swatting at the air, but Pepi, who happened to be inspecting the warehouses that day, did not move. He stood in the doorway, transfixed by what he saw, the living carpet of black and red converging on the same shining pool. The boy nearest the spill screamed as the insects reached his ankles, biting and stinging in waves. The other labourers fled, but Pepi stepped closer. He watched as the insect's frenzy unfolded, how hunger turned to chaos, how the movement of one species triggered another, how the human body became a battlefield of nature's design. The boy writhed, smearing honey and blood together, until the overseer dragged him out and doused him in water. He survived barely. That night Pepi ordered the overseer and the injured worker brought before him. The man's skin was blistered, his voice raw. Pepi asked him questions. How long had it taken before he could no longer stand? Which bite burned most? Did the stings differ when the honey mixed with blood? When the man could not answer, Pepi ordered him cleaned, fed and sent to the royal infirmary. He told the physicians to preserve the subject for further study. Within a week, Pepi had summoned his chemists and priests to recreate the event. The boy from the warehouse became the prototype. The room was sterilized, the floor sealed with bitumen to hold fluids, and the experiment repeated. The insects did what they had done before, but this time there was structure observation measurement. The results satisfied Pepi. He called it the revelation of sweetness. From that seed grew the most infamous institution of his reign, the honey chambers. At first there was only one room. Within a year there were 9. Each served a precise function designed not merely for torture but for study, a laboratory of agony disguised as ritual. The preparation chamber came first. Here the chosen subjects were clean shaved and oiled so the honey would adhere evenly. Priests in white linen anointed them, chanting verses that blended prayer with calibration. Every angle of the human body was measured, every limb positioned to ensure visibility from the observation platform above. Next was the honey room, the centerpiece of the complex. The air there was permanently scented with decay and sugar. Servants used brushes made from palm fronds to coat the subjects layer by layer until the skin glistened like amber glass. The viscosity was adjusted daily, depending on temperature, thicker in heat, thinner in winter. The mixture itself was formulaic, equal parts honey, human saliva, and trace amounts of blood. Pepi's apothecaries discovered that the addition of fear-induced sweat altered the honey's chemistry, making it irresistible to carnivorous insects. Then came the beetle pit. Beneath the floor, hundreds of scarabs were kept in darkness, starved for 5 days to maximize aggression. When released, they swarmed toward the scent, their mandibles clattering like rain on stone. The attendants took notes on bite speed and coordination, classifying the scarabs by appetite. The sound, witnesses later said, was worse than the sight, the wet rhythmic clicking of hunger at work. The serpent chamber was adjacent, reserved for those who survived the beetles. There the priests introduced snakes from Nubia and Libya, species bred for venom that paralyzed without killing. Victims stiffened but remained conscious, their eyes wide open as the creatures coiled around them. Pepi believed this frozen awareness brought the soul closest to divine perception. The water room followed a chamber where victims were submerged in shallow basins lined with reeds that concealed biting eels and water scorpions. The water diluted the honey but extended suffering. Drowning was carefully prevented. Priests sang over the bubbling, timing hymns to respiration. The fire chamber came next, opposite in element but identical in purpose. Here thin sheets of bronze were heated until glowing, then waved above the body to blister without charring. Scribes recorded how screams changed pitch as temperature increased. It was said that Pepi called this the voice of purification. Afterwards, survivors were taken to the recovery room where physicians worked with detached precision. They applied salves, stitched wounds, fed victims herbs to restore strength. This was not mercy, it was maintenance. To preserve data, the subjects had to live. Each survivor was catalogued by endurance score and returned to the rotation once healed. Some lasted months, others years, their bodies transformed into archives of scars. The 8th chamber was the disposal room, silent and utilitarian. There the bodies of those who finally expired were drained, washed and cremated. Ashes were mixed with the remains of honey, then sealed in pottery jars. The priest said the mixture could cure disease. Nobles paid for it as a medicine. Pepi called it recycling holiness. At the centre of it all was the observation platform, a raised dais ringed with alabaster balustrades built for the pharaoh himself. From there Pepi could see every room through latticed windows. A network of tunnels carried sound upward, ensuring no scream was lost. Beneath his throne was a set of copper pipes designed to channel the cries as a faint continuous hum. To Pepi it was music proof that the god spoke through suffering. The design of the complex revealed his genius as much as his depravity. The chambers were arranged in a perfect square around a central courtyard, each aligned with a cardinal point: north for cold, south for heat, east for birth, west for death. The walls were covered with reliefs, depicting bees, serpents and suns, their symbolic meanings twisted to fit Pepi's theology. Sweetness as sacrifice, venom as revelation, light as exposure. Insect husbandry became a science. Entire estates were repurposed into breeding grounds. Beekeepers were ordered to increase production tenfold, their hives guarded by soldiers. Farmers grew flowers not for nectar, but for cruelty. Wasps were kept in clay jars with perforated lids. Ants fed on meat to heighten aggression. The priests of Ra blessed the colonies each morning, reciting litanies about transformation, the cycle of consumption and rebirth. Soon even the laboratories began to take on religious significance. Scribes called them the mouths of the gods. Every species had its hymn. Scarabs represented rebirth ants, devotion wasps, divine vengeance. The theology spread faster than the insects themselves. To keep the complex operational, Pepi created new professions. Mixers of honey oversaw chemical ratios. Masters of venom bred snakes for specific paralysis intervals. Counters of screams timed each reaction for comparison. The empire's scholars, men once dedicated to astronomy and mathematics, now debated formulas of pain. The honey chambers became both temple and machine. When Pepi visited, he was carried on a golden litter, his withered frame hidden behind perfumed curtains. Servants lowered him onto the platform where he would watch for hours, issuing quiet commands. Add smoke to the wasps. Shift the light. Let me see the eyes. Record the change when hope leaves. His attendants wrote quickly, their faces expressionless. They did not know they were helping to codify one of history's earliest manuals of controlled agony. And yet in Pepi's mind this was not cruelty. It was revelation. The gods, he wrote, hid truth in sweetness and sting. To know one we must endure the other. What had begun as spilled honey had become the state's new theology, a fusion of chemistry, faith and power that transformed Egypt into a hive devoted to one purpose, the study of suffering as divine order. The honey chambers were not built in a single day, but from the moment the first scream echoed beneath their stone ceilings, Egypt had changed forever. The accident had become a doctrine, and the doctrine had found its architect. They timed everything to living clocks. The attendants consulted charts pinned to a cedar post before each session, little diagrams of moons, sun angles, and insect activity, because nature itself was an input in the experiment. Scarabs, it noted, reached peak aggression at dusk. Fire ants moved fastest in the hour before sunrise. Wasps lost coordination as temperature dropped below a certain threshold. The planners measured not only bodies but hours. A typical session began long before any victim felt a jar touch his skin. At first light, physicians took baseline readings, pulse color of the sclera, moisture of the lips, a quick test of tendon reflex. These were logged in neat columns on slates that would be copied to papyrus by evening. Each boy received a small ration of lotus wine, never enough to dull perception, only to steady to remove the risk of fainting, which would ruin the eater. The aim was not to kill quickly, but to hold a life on a thread of consciousness long enough to observe its unspooling. They sedated carefully. The balms and powders mixed in the palace apothecary were recipes refined through trial and ledger. A sedative too strong produced silence without revelation. Too weak and panic snapped the subject into useless convulsions. So the physicians who once would have sworn only to heal now measured narcotics as a precision instrument. A needle of opium here, a poultice of mandrake there, each touch calculated to lengthen the window of awake suffering by minutes, then hours. They called it controlled wakefulness. The chamber itself was a stage in which each element could be adjusted like a lens. The attendants strapped limbs to the carved stone, leaving the torso free to arch the fingers to curl. Restraints were leather wax to prevent chafing, but fitted tight enough to prevent the body from curling away from pain. They recorded the angle of each strap in a logbook. Slight rotations altered the way muscles engaged and therefore the pattern of cries. Pepi liked asymmetry. He believed the world revealed more truth when it was uneven. From his observation rostrum, he would sometimes call down more left-side exposure or shift the head, let the right eye see first. The technicians bowed and adjusted the boy by degrees, rendering suffering a sculpted thing. Then the honey was applied. Brushes moved in practiced arcs, depositing viscous ribbons along ribs behind knees across the soft web of the instep. The composition might change more saliva for winter extra salt when humidity promised to blunt wasp aggression. The compound was not merely attractant, it was chemical choreography. Insects came because chemistry sang to them. The team of insect keepers, children of beekeepers and masters of trap and lure kept notes on their charges, which ants responded to warmed honey, which beetles preferred protein-scented glaze. They timed releases to the second, pushing the session through phases, the same way a conductor moves from adagio to presto. First, the beetles, a carpet of black bodies that chewed at surface flesh and honey, alike their mandibles working in chorus. They were released en masse through a trapdoor that opened like a mouth. They flooded the skin in seconds and began their steady work. The recording scribe marked the minute the first bite landed, the minute the first scream rose, the minute the throat tightened. A watcher in the corner measured vocal frequency with a reed anemic technology perhaps, but it gave patterns higher pitches at the onset, lower as shock set in. When the beetles reached the stage, Pepi wanted the ant columns were funneled in along leather gutters. Their venom burned in lines like calligraphy, and the room's temperature was raised by braziers to increase circulation and exacerbate the sting. The wasps kept in cages that vibrated with borrowed smoke to heighten agitation arrived last, their stings causing rapid swelling that could obscure vision and mask faces. The sequence was designed so that no single agent finished the work. Rather, they layered one form of agony on top of another, until the human subject became a map of multiple injuries. Sessions were not brutal for brutality's sake, but for resolution. Pepi's notes after one such evening read like an engineer's comments: beetle dispersal at +3 minutes increases surface lesion by 12%. Antline at +11 produces longer vocal decay. Wasps at +26 cause facial edema obscuring identity desirable for certain demonstrations. There is a clinical economy in those numbers, a calculus meant to maximize observation while maintaining survivability. Mid-session, when bodies threatened to slip into unconsciousness, attendants administered corrective drafts, small cups with bitter, sharp-tasting decoctions to rouse the nervous system. They called it returning the witness. Physicians watched the pupils and adjusted dosages. At no point did they pretend to be merciful. They argued in measured tones about half-life and clearance about whether to prolong the evening by an hour for a more instructive arc. Survival was inventory. Each life kept after a session was an asset for future studies. Recovery was equally bureaucratic. Those who survived were not merely cleaned. They were rehabilitated with the same thrift applied to stock. The recovery room ran like a storeroom. Linen rolls were allocated by degree of injury. Poultices were dispensed with dated receipts. Physicians logged which herbs accelerated wound contraction and which caused scarring patterns that Pepi favoured for subsequent psychological impact. They weighed risks against returns. A boy with a scar pattern classified as type B retained mobility visible. Mark might be worth tens of count cycles. One whose lungs had been compromised was archived early. The ledger column labelled projected reusability was as blunt as any official and numerical forecast of how many more sessions a boy could endure. Cost management extended beyond flesh. The apothecary kept track of honey consumption per session, insect mortality rates, and the salt used in recovery salves. Even the priests recorded incense use and the allocation of temple oil to mask the odour of the chambers. The economy of atrocity had metrics, budgets, and checks. A failed experiment, too many deaths in a single night, could mean reprimands and reassignment. Efficiency meant fewer bodies wasted and more data retained. There was etiquette to the audience as well. The inner court that attended sessions was small and selected scribes who catalogued results, priests who translated suffering into omen advisors who wrote dispatches, men whose livelihood depended on the quality of the night's observations. They kept silence, heads, bowed eyes on the pharaoh, breathing shallow so as not to disturb his absorption. Sometimes Pepi would gesture for an adjustment. He rarely spoke. His orders were often a single word or a precise notch in the hourglass. Those who hesitated were dismissed or worse reassigned to recruitment duty where understanding could quickly become participation. Even the disposal had procedure. When subjects finally crossed the threshold, their remains were processed according to type. Those considered unsuitable for archiving were quietly removed, wrapped, numbered, and sent into pits dug beyond the low walls of Memphis, their bones interred without rites. Others, particularly those from noble families used for sanctioned transformation, were treated as relics, their ashes anointed with temple oil and mixed with honey as supposed talismans. The priests sold portions to the superstitious, the merchants bought them as charms, and the markets swallowed the shame under the guise of faith. For the ordinary citizen, the machine looked like inevitability. The records looked like law. The terms quota, inventory, reusability were ordinary nouns until someone read them aloud and recognized what they named. In the palace, cruelty moved with the same predictability as the sun. It had its opening ritual, its crescendo, and its accounting. It had watchers who measured, clerks who recorded, and physicians who kept the data clean. And somewhere above it all, behind lattice stone, the pharaoh read the night's report by torchlight and marked the margins with a reed. The ink dried on figures that treated suffering as fact. The sessions continued, each one a lesson in the grammar of atrocity, how to structure horror so that it could be taught, reproduced and improved. In a world measured by harvests and floods, Pepi's court had invented a new calendar, not of planting and reaping, but of cycles, survivals and returns. The months were no longer only named by the Nile's moods. They counted how many lives remained usable, how many jars of honey were required to elicit a particular response, how long a scream could be extended before it vanished into noise. This was standard operating cruelty, dedicated, bureaucratic, and terrifyingly ordinary. When the Nile began to fail, Egypt should have turned to prayer and prudence. Instead, it turned to honey. The river's rhythm, its gentle swelling each year, was the heart that fed the kingdom. For generations, its floods had laid down silt richer than gold, renewing the fields, dictating the empire's pulse. But in the latter decades of Pepi's reign, something shifted. The inundations grew erratic. Some years the waters crept timidly, stopping short of the outer fields. Other years they rose late and receded too quickly. Drought followed, then famine. Grain warehouses emptied, bread grew thin and bitter. Yet rather than divert resources to the hungry, Egypt found itself cultivating flowers. The pharaoh's appetite had reprogrammed the economy. Beekeeping, once a modest craft, became an industry, its scale breathtaking, its purpose monstrous. Entire provinces were reassigned from grain to nectar. Tax quotas were rewritten. Honey replaced wheat, bees replaced cattle petals, replaced grain heads. The overseer of royal entertainments issued decrees regulating colour and fragrance. Certain blooms produced sweeter honey that drew the scarabs faster, burned longer under torchlight, and released a scent the pharaoh claimed pleased the gods. In Upper Egypt, fields that had once fed thousands now shimmered with wildflowers, hyacinth, lotus, chamomile, useless to hunger, but sacred to spectacle. Farmers who objected vanished. Those who obeyed were told their work was divine. Each hive was registered, each jar stamped with the royal cartouche. The state even measured the sweetness of honey with imported copper scales, an absurd precision considering that peasants in the delta were eating mud cakes mixed with papyrus root to survive. The honey boom rippled outward through every trade. Potters who once shaped amphorae for grain and beer now laboured to produce smaller, perfectly sealed vessels for ritual storage. Their kilns burned day and night, their clay mixed with ash and oil to prevent leakage. Merchants began to specialise in honey logistics, camel caravans carrying barrels from as far as Canaan, boatmen ferrying the sticky gold upriver. Markets once filled with onions and fish now glittered with jars of syrup. To supply Pepi's experiments, craftsmen invented new tools: brass brushes for spreading shallow cedar boxes to restrain victims, funnels designed to pour honey in thin aesthetic spirals. Every artisan who touched the trade was told it was holy work. The temples blessed the hives, the scribes composed hymns to bees. Even children sang new songs in the fields, sweetness for the sun, stings for the moon, offerings for the Lord above. But beneath the surface hunger grew, the floral conversion starved the countryside. When bees took priority over barley, the land lost its balance. The same canals that once irrigated wheat now fed only flower beds. The farmers who had once harvested for families now harvested for chambers they would never see. Grain prices tripled. Peasants sold their daughters to buy bread. The Nile's failure might have been survivable. Egypt had weathered lean years before, but the redirection of resources toward ritual guaranteed catastrophe. And yet the bureaucracy thrived. Numbers continued to climb, at least on papyrus. Reports recorded honey output in precise datums, ignoring the fact that there was no bread to weigh it against. When inspectors arrived, they did not ask about famine victims, but about nectar yields. The overseer's office boasted of record sweetness even as villages emptied. The network required to maintain Pepi's obsession became a civilization unto itself. Insects had their own supply lines, a living trade route pulsing beneath the empire's skin. Specialist breeders emerged, the masters of scarabs, the keepers of venom, the heralds of fire ants. They tended colonies in temperature-controlled pits, feeding them slivers of meat and blood to refine their aggression. Some regions built entire facilities dedicated to breeding wasps, using smoke to keep them enraged. Scrolls recorded breeding cycles, starvation periods, and optimal transport temperatures. The insects were better fed than many citizens. Even the carpenters felt the empire's transformation. They no longer built furniture or boats, but coffers and restraints. Workshops near Thebes specialized in cedar boxes with carved headrests and drainage grooves. Others produced observation stools, tall stands designed to elevate victims for better sightlines. The tools of torture were traded and taxed like any other commodity. Meanwhile, the temples adapted their theology. Honey became sacred currency. Priests declared that its golden hue embodied the sun's eternal essence, that to produce it was to serve the god-king directly. Offerings of honey replaced bread on altars. Hymns described the sweetness as the sweat of Ra. In doing so, they consecrated an entire economy of exploitation. The paradox deepened with every drought. As famine worsened, honey exports increased. Ships left Memphis laden with jars destined for foreign markets, Byblos, Crete, the Levant where merchants paid in cedar, tin and incense. What had once been a domestic foodstuff was now a luxury export, its profits funneled straight into the maintenance of the honey chambers. Egypt starved while its ruler exported sweetness. Historians now speak of this period as the inversion when nourishment became spectacle, and production divorced itself from survival. The land's bounty, instead of sustaining life, was redirected to sustain the illusion of divine vitality. The courtiers praised it as devotion. The farmers cursed it as madness. Climate change magnified the corruption. Each weak flood meant less grain, more flowers, more honey, and therefore more victims. Pepi's officials rationalized the crisis. The gods sent drought to demand more offerings. The logic devoured itself. The more Egypt suffered, the more honey was produced to appease divine wrath. The more honey was produced, the fewer mouths could eat. At the peak of this inversion, archaeological records show staggering honey yields more than triple any prior dynasty. But the same strata reveal famine burials, shallow graves filled with entire families. Skeletal analyses show malnutrition so severe that children's bones grew warped. The empire that had once fed the world could no longer feed itself. Still, the reports that reached Pepi's throne spoke only of success. Output increased subsequent, insect health excellent. Scent intensity surpasses prior standards. No mention of death, of collapse of rivers running low. The administration of pleasure had become immune to reality. One scribe, whose private diary survived sealed within a jar, wrote a line that captured the age's contradiction. We trade hunger for sweetness, darkness for light, life for performance. The fields are blooming and the people are gone. In later centuries, the honey of this era would fossilize, crystallizing inside forgotten jars buried with priests. Archaeologists would find it still gleaming, perfectly preserved, while the bones of those who starved beside its making turned to dust. That is the essence of Pepi's economy, the alchemy of collapse. The Nile withered, the people hungered, and the pharaoh's empire gleamed brighter than ever. Egypt's sweetness had become its rot. A starving kingdom had learned to feed its god with the very substance it denied to itself. And that's how climate turned from misfortune to weapon, how drought became dogma, and appetite became the only harvest left to reap. Across Egypt, a strange quiet began to settle, a quiet measured not in sound, but in the absence of children's voices. Markets that once rang with laughter grew eerily composed. In the courtyards of Thebes, in the alleyways of Abydos, even the reed boats that ferried families across the Nile seemed emptier. The empire still looked alive, still traded and prayed and built, but a generation was quietly vanishing. At first, the disappearance was hidden behind paperwork. The bureaucracy was expert at disguising decline. Scribes adjusted census tablets to maintain expected numbers. Birth registries were quietly rewritten names of the taken duplicated to suggest continuity. The tax rolls, calculated partly by household size, never changed. On papyrus, Egypt was as fertile as ever. In truth, every new census was an act of fiction. The governors were complicit. Each nome had quotas to meet deliveries of boys demanded by the overseer of royal entertainments. To admit shortage was to invite execution. So they falsified reports. The governor of Hierakonpolis claimed a miraculous rise in male births. The steward of Edfu insisted half his province had been struck by the sleep plague, rendering sons unfit for service. In Abydos, officials produced entire ledgers of invented deaths, river fever, hippo, trampling desert raids. No one checked. The paperwork satisfied the capital. But the truth could not be hidden from the villages. When recruiters came, they came before dawn, bearing temple seals and honeyed words. Your son has been chosen, they told the families, to serve the living God. Those who refused were branded heretics. Those who fought were slain. Within a decade, an entire stratum of Egypt's youth boys between 8 and 14 had become a harvest crop feeding the machinery beneath Memphis. Archaeologists would later find the evidence in silent cemeteries that skip a generation burial sites, filled with elders and infants but no adolescents. In village after village, the same pattern repeats: boys simply gone. Where they should have been carved into stelae or named in family offerings, there is blank stone. Families desperate to protect their sons turned to ingenuity and despair. Some scarred their boys, deliberately pressing heated copper coins against cheeks to mar symmetry. Others broke fingers or legs, leaving visible deformities. The god desires perfection, they whispered. He will not take the flawed. Mothers fed their children herbal mixtures, brewed from lotus and myrrh concoctions meant to raise fevers and rashes. The hope was that sickness would repel the recruiters. But word spread quickly, and the priests began proclaiming that the god heals imperfection, turning even deformity into a mark of selection. The wealthy bribed officials to record false deaths. They buried symbolic dolls wrapped in linen, held mock funerals, and scribed fake tombstones so their sons could be declared with the ancestors. Others fled to the borderlands, hiding their children among Nubian traders or desert caravans. But flight was perilous. Patrols watched the routes, and many families died of thirst trying to escape the Nile's reach. It was the poor who suffered most. With no land, no bribes, no influence, they could only hide their sons beneath reed mats or bury them alive in shallow pits during raids, breathing through hollow reeds until soldiers passed. Some villages smeared their boys in animal dung and mud to disguise them as slaves or beasts. Others turned communal, sharing the risk, each family giving up one child so that others might live. One to save many, they said, their voices trembling between guilt and relief. The most tragic strategy came from the oases, when scouts approached entire villages, staged epidemics coating their boys with crushed blue lotus to mimic necrosis, lying them in rows of feigned corpses while mothers wailed. Once it worked, twice too. But by the third time the scouts saw through it. They burned the village for deceit and took the surviving boys as punishment. Historians call this phase the demography of absence. It is the point where statistics become ghosts, where the living holes between numbers tell more than any inscription. By Pepi's 60th year, whole provinces had lost 70% of their male children. The imbalance warped everything. Farming declined because there were too few hands to lift the ploughs. Armies weakened. Soldiers were old men and half-grown boys. Marriages faltered as the next generation vanished. In the temples, priests invented new prayers to mask the demographic collapse. They claimed that the god-king was transforming children into spirits who would protect the harvest. The hymn of renewal once sung for fertility was rewritten to celebrate the chosen sons. The line "they sleep beneath the honeyed earth" became a national refrain. No one dared speak what it truly meant. In the capital, the overseer's clerks reported only success. They praised the smooth flow of offerings from the provinces, boasting that quotas were exceeded. To maintain appearances, the palace issued token decrees of gratitude to governors who met delivery numbers, gifting them scarab amulets or rings of electrum. The machinery of lies became self-sustaining, falsified reports feeding falsified rewards each layer, masking the rot beneath. But the fractures showed. Entire villages ceased sending tax shipments not out of rebellion, but because there was no one left to work. The elders buried their tools beside their sons' empty beds. Honey flowed north, but grain stopped. In a surviving letter, a provincial scribe confides to a friend in Thebes, "We have learned to count absence as wealth. Each missing boy is a mark of loyalty. Each silent household is a sign of peace. We have no laughter left, and so we sleep earlier." In the ruins of those villages, archaeologists later found small clay figurines of bees, crudely made by women. They were buried under doorways, perhaps as charms of protection, perhaps as symbols of mourning. Their wings were always broken. For the lower classes, lineage itself became casualty. Sons were the hands that tilled the heirs who performed ancestor rites. Without them, families ceased to exist in the afterlife. Their names died with their bodies. Egypt, obsessed with immortality, was quietly committing demographic suicide. And yet for decades the machine kept running. Pepi's officials understood that a starving empire can limp on, a grieving one can be silenced. But when it loses its children, it begins to forget itself. By the time foreign traders noticed, the damage was irreversible. One Babylonian merchant wrote in his travel log, "In the villages of the southern river, I saw no boys playing by the water, only old men with empty nets and women who sang to ghosts. Egypt's greatest famine was not of food, but of future. And still the honey flowed north, still the quotas were met, still the empire reported abundance. On papyrus, Egypt thrived. In the villages, Egypt disappeared. They called themselves the fathers of the lost. Farmers, potters, boatmen, men who had once sung to the Nile now turned into phantoms haunting its banks. Their sons were gone taken by the recruiters with temple seals and polished smiles, and something inside them had broken past fear. At first their defiance was scattered, born of chance. A caravan ambushed near Abydos. 12 boys freed 2 scouts killed. A transport barge sunk in a side canal after nightfall, its guards silenced with fishing spears. The upriver towns whispered the news like prayer. Hope moved along the water faster than any official message someone fought back. Within months, the small axe joined into a current. Bands of grieving fathers began moving by night, guided by boatmen who knew the Nile's secret channels. They struck quickly and vanished, taking advantage of the bureaucracy's blindness. Their attacks were quiet, calculated, almost reverent ambushes planned by men who had spent a lifetime studying the patience of flood and drought. They carried no banners, no symbols, only the memory of names that no longer had faces. In the beginning they succeeded. A convoy near Koptos was intercepted before dawn. 30 boys released into the reeds, their chains hacked apart with farming tools. One overseer was spared deliberately so he could tell the story. Tell the pharaoh, they said, that the river has begun to take back what is his, but victory like honey attracts ruin. The pharaoh's response came with terrible precision. Pepi convened his court and declared a new law: rebellion is contagion. To cure it, the wound must be cauterized. He summoned the priests of Ra and decreed that every act of resistance would be punished not in secret, but as ritual demonstration. The honey chambers, once hidden beneath Memphis, became theatres of deterrence. Within days, the first captured rebels were brought to the palace. Witnesses describe a crowd summoned by decree officials, soldiers and families of the missing, all ordered to watch. The rebels were bound in pairs, father and son, where both had been caught. Pepi's command was simple. The fathers were to be coated in honey, the sons forced to witness. The priests sang hymns to justice as the insects were released. The sons' screams joined their fathers before being silenced in turn. From that day, each new rebellion ended in spectacle. The honey rituals became public, not entertainment, not quite execution, but a calculated message. See, the priests would say what happens to those who defy the divine. Scrolls describing these cleansings were distributed to provincial temples, ensuring that terror preceded every caravan. Still, the fathers persisted for a time. They struck harder, desperately, and certain of death. A papyrus fragment recovered from a burned garrison near Elephantine records their credo in jagged script: "We do not fight to win. We fight so that the gods must watch." Their movement spread southward toward Nubia, where Egypt's reach weakened. The border villages sheltered them, feeding fugitives, hiding freed boys in reed huts and desert caves. For half a year, liberation flickered like candlelight across the frontier. Pepi's caravans grew fearful. Some even turned back empty. The pharaoh's rage swelled to something almost cosmic. He unleashed his final deterrence. The chronicles of that retribution survive only in Nubian oral tradition, a tale recited for centuries, whispered by desert fires. It tells of a village called Kernu, perched along a tributary where the rebels had found refuge. When Pepi's soldiers arrived, they demanded the usual tribute, 50 boys aged between 8 and 12. The villagers refused. The commander gave them 3 days to comply. On the third sunrise, the soldiers entered and found the square silent. Every door barred, every window shuttered. They broke them open and discovered what no weapon could undo. The entire village, over 800 souls, had gathered in the square the night before. Parents had mixed powdered poison into bowls of beer and shared it as communion. They had sung hymns to Osiris and drunk together, holding their children close. When morning came, all were gone. The commander ordered the dead stripped and examined. Many still held hands. Pepi's officers sent word to Memphis. The pharaoh's fury was beyond reason. He commanded that even the corpses be brought north, that none should cheat justice through death. The journey took weeks, the stench unbearable. When the bodies arrived, Pepi ordered them covered in honey and displayed in the palace courtyard under the sun. Witnesses said the air shimmered with flies for days. The priest declared that the village had been purified. The people called it the massacre of sweetness. From then on, resistance ended. The fathers were hunted across the delta and deserts alike. Captured rebels were paraded through the streets of Memphis, their tongues removed so they could not curse. The last known cell, 23 men, was captured near Dendera. Their fate was recorded by a clerk named Senbet, whose tablet was later found buried beneath his house. His Majesty ordered them alive to the honey chambers there to witness the fate of their own. They were arranged in rings, each man bound facing another. The first ring was coated, the second forced to watch. When one expired, the next was coated until no ring remained. Deterrence had become theology. The honey chambers now served not merely the pharaoh's appetite but the state's survival. Each atrocity was presented as balance, the divine correction of disobedience. But something shifted in those years. The same machinery that fed Pepi's pleasure began to feed his paranoia. Convoys moved with double escorts. Villagers were ordered to keep torches burning all night to ward off rebellion. The priests declared the Nile's continued failure as proof that Egypt's faith was weakening, not realizing the opposite was true, faith was dying. And yet the pharaoh smiled. In his eyes, deterrence worked. The quotas resumed, the honey flowed, the silence returned. Only the songs of Nubia remembered otherwise. Their verses still mourn the village that chose death over surrender. One line survives the centuries scratched later into a sandstone wall near the border. We went to the gods together, so the god could not find us alone. It is the purest act of defiance in Egypt's history, an entire people denying a tyrant his spectacle. And for that refusal, Pepi's cruelty reached its final form. The message was no longer warning, it was demonstration. Each act of resistance would henceforth be a performance for his throne. The fathers of the lost were gone, but their silence became the sound that would one day end a civilization. By the time Pepi entered his 80th year, Egypt's sickness could no longer be contained within its borders. The contagion of cruelty had begun to rot its trade arteries, first quietly, then all at once. The old merchants from Sumer stopped at the delta ports and went no farther. Levantine sailors, once eager to barter for gold and papyrus, now sailed wide arcs around Egyptian waters. In the harbour of Byblos, a clay tablet was hung like a warning sign. Any ship that docks in the land of honeyed death shall be cast from our temples for a year. Across the Fertile Crescent, whispers spread of Egypt's curse. Word of the honey rituals, distorted but recognisable, reached the markets of Ur and Mari, told by trembling sailors who swore they'd heard the screams carried over the water at night. Sumerian priests revolted, declared that Egypt's honey had become unclean food, the product of spirits devouring their young. Egyptian goods once prized were burned in temple courtyards as purification offerings. The banishment was not only moral, it was practical. Tin merchants closed their ledgers. Without tin, bronze could not be made. Armories ran dry, smithies fell silent, ploughs broke unrepaired. In Byblos, Lebanese cedar essential for ships and sacred architecture was withheld. Egypt's shipwrights, who had once built vessels that kissed every horizon, now patched their fleets with reeds and local acacia that splintered under sea wind. Incense from Punt, the fragrance of divinity itself, ceased arriving. Priests were left with cold altars, their rituals incomplete, their gods offended. The isolation spread like famine. Trade embargoes hardened into spiritual exiles. A Canaanite decree etched in soft limestone declared, "Let no trader from the land of honey set foot among us, lest the flies of their sin follow him." Egyptian emissaries found doors closed, caravans diverted, contracts voided by silence. Even the mysterious sea peoples who feared nothing and plundered everything avoided the Nile's mouth, claiming that the air there hums with the cries of children. Nubia, once a tributary ally, broke ties entirely. Its gold mines sealed, its fortresses strengthened along the border. Carved into sandstone near the Second Cataract was a single inscription, both threat and prayer. "We have built walls not of stone but of hearts that will not serve a monster." Egypt's response was denial. The scribes recorded the loss of trade as temporary setbacks. Pepi's ministers declared self-sufficiency a divine isolation. But reality told another story. Workshops closed. Temples that had once perfumed the air with frankincense now stank of stagnant oil. The bronze statues of gods darkened with corrosion because no tin remained for polish. The economic collapse rippled into every corner. Without bronze tools, farming regressed. Wooden ploughs broke and could not be replaced. Without cedar, the great ships of the Nile cracked and sank, cutting off what little commerce remained. Without incense, purification rites failed. Corpses spoiled faster in the heat, and priests began using honey as substitute balm. The symbolism was grotesque, sweetness masking decay, the kingdom embalming itself in the very substance of its corruption. Foreign traders recorded their disgust in clay and stone. A merchant tablet found in Ugarit reads, "To deal with them is to invite the flies. The god-king feeds upon his own. The land is full of ghosts." Another from Dilmun warns its captains, "Sail east of the honey ports. West winds carry sickness of the soul." Even the desert tribes withdrew. Caravans that once crossed Sinai bearing turquoise and salt took new routes through Edom and the Negev. The maps of the era show a hole where Egypt once was a literal blank between known lands. Inside that hole, the empire starved. The price of bread tripled again, then ceased to matter when there was no grain. The peasants ate locusts, the nobles their horses, yet in the palace the honey jars never emptied. The same bees that no longer pollinated crops thrived under armed protection in walled estates. Pepi's court tried to conceal the collapse through propaganda. Temple murals depicted overflowing granaries, healthy children, foreign delegations bearing gifts. But even the pigments betrayed the lie, cheap ochres, replacing once bright lapis substitutes for the trade minerals now unobtainable. On some surviving frescoes, artists painted empty boats drifting toward the horizon, their sails torn a quiet rebellion in colour. As Egypt's ports emptied so, too did its prayers. The gods who had once guarded its horizon seemed to turn their faces away. The priests spoke to empty sanctuaries. When they burned the last of the imported incense, the smoke rose thin and grey, dissolving, before it reached the temple roof. In the private records of a Theban priest, one of the few who dared to write what others only whispered, appears this lament: "Our God has become an island, and we the drowned. The bees swarm the altars, the flies feed on the offerings. We call it devotion, but it smells of rot." What had begun as moral contagion now manifested as material collapse. A civilization built on a trade faith and fertility had become radioactive to the ancient world. Egypt was no longer feared for its armies or revered for its wisdom, it was shunned for its appetite. The pharaoh's courts still glittered with gold, but gold could no longer buy what mattered: food trust absolution. The honey that once symbolized abundance now represented only decay. It coated the empire's hands, sticky and sweet, impossible to wash away. And beyond the borders, the world turned its face, whispering that Egypt, brightest jewel of the Nile, had become a land unfit for the living. By the time the foreign world turned its back, even Egypt's own gods had begun to retreat. The temples that had once thundered with hymns now murmured only with euphemism. The Theban clergy, the same priests who had crowned Pepi as a living son, started to rewrite their prayers. The cartouches carved into sanctuaries no longer bore his name. Where once they had proclaimed "He who lives forever," now they read only "the Ancient One." The title sounded reverent, but it was a linguistic veil, a way of invoking the pharaoh without honouring him. Temple inscriptions began to fracture under the chisel, the faithful phrases eroded by careful hands. When questioned, the priests spoke of ritual damage or restoration. But everyone knew the gods were being asked to forget. The treasury of Amun at Thebes, once the empire's second capital, closed its bronze doors and announced divine poverty. The priests claimed the god required silence and austerity. In truth, the coffers were empty. Gold shipments from Nubia had ceased, incense had vanished, and offerings from the starving provinces dwindled to nothing. The priests bartered temple linen for grain-melted statues for food. They wrapped their desecration in scripture, calling it the transmutation of form. Other sanctuaries followed. At Abydos, the temple of Osiris replaced honey libations with plain water. At Heliopolis, the great sun temple extinguished its eternal flame for purification. The holy calendar that had ordered life for 1,000 years began to disintegrate. Ceremonies were skipped, festivals shortened, feast days forgotten. The clergy masters of coded speech never condemned Pepi directly, but their silences grew longer, their metaphors more transparent. Hymns once sung to glorify him became dirges in disguise. One fragment carved into a wall at Dendera reads, "The light that burns too long devours its own oil." Another scratched hastily into the base of a column, simply, "The child has outlived the mother." Behind the incense and formalities, fear ruled. The palace's spies infiltrated temples, eavesdropping on sermons, testing loyalty. A priest who used the wrong epithet might vanish before morning prayers. Yet even under threat avoidance, spread like contagion. Clergy who once competed for proximities to the throne now begged postings in distant shrines anywhere beyond Memphis's shadow. As the priesthood withdrew, the army collapsed beside it. Egypt's generals' men who had once marched in glittering ranks found themselves commanding ghosts. Recruitment had dried up with the Nile. The youth who might have filled the ranks were gone, taken broken or dead. The remaining officers were old, bitter, and frightened of being reassigned to procurement duty. Desertion became epidemic, first among common soldiers, then among captains, and finally among generals themselves. Garrison after garrison melted away into the dunes, taking their families and whatever provisions they could carry. They did not fight or rebel, they simply vanished into silence. Some formed wandering bands that raided caravans for survival. Others found refuge in the oases, becoming mercenaries for foreign tribes. Egypt's proud army, the spine of its empire, dissolved into dust, swallowed by the very desert it once guarded. The only soldiers who remained were those bound by terror rather than loyalty, the palace guard. They were a close circle now cut off from the rest of Egypt, recruited from orphans whose parents had been executed, trained from childhood to obey without question. They guarded the honey chambers, the treasury, and Pepi's withering body. Their armour was polished bronze, but beneath it they were hollow men, living ghosts in a world collapsing around them. The palace itself had become both fortress and tomb. Its corridors echoed with the metallic footsteps of the guard. Their movements timed like clockwork, a choreography of control. Outside the palace walls, Memphis decayed. The markets bare, the courtyards filled with beggars, the smell of honey mixing with rot. Inside, time was suspended. The pharaoh's court still held its rituals, banquets, processions, decrees, but they had become theatre for an audience of none. Pepi's decrees grew stranger. He ordered that mirrors be banned from the palace, claiming reflections distracted the boss. He commanded that all lamps burn with honey instead of oil, filling the air with sickly sweetness. When the priests protested the waste, he accused them of hoarding divine light. He then decreed that the Theban temples must send weekly reports affirming their devotion, each report signed in blood. The few priests who complied did so with trembling hands. Many sent blank scrolls instead, a form of defiance disguised as obedience. When Pepi's inspectors discovered the deception, entire temple staffs were executed. Yet the blank scrolls continued to arrive. By now, Egypt's religion had split in two. There was the official faith, the honeyed pantomime of Memphis, where priests chanted to please the pharaoh, and the quiet faith of survival whispered in rural shrines where farmers prayed directly to the Nile and begged it to wash their sins away. Even the palace guard began to lose coherence. Their captains were executed regularly to prevent mutiny. New recruits were promoted before they had grown old enough to question orders. In the taverns of Memphis, people whispered that the guard's armour was cursed, that once it touched a man's shoulders he would forget his own name. Yet for all their brutality, they were the last functioning limb of a dying organism. They kept the walls standing, the chambers sealed, the screams contained. They patrolled the river docks to intercept deserters, confiscated food shipments, and guarded the honey stores as though guarding the heart of Egypt itself. Inside those walls, the last illusion persisted that the system still worked, that the pharaoh's will still held the world together. But outside, everything it protected was gone: the fields, the armies, the temples, the trust of nations, and the faith of its own people. Egypt had become a body devouring itself. The priests had looked away, the soldiers had walked away, and the people had wasted away. Only the guard remained metal shells around an empty throne. And behind that thin wall, the devouring core still pulsed sweet and foul, waiting to consume whatever was left. The final years of Pepi's reign felt less like the end of a dynasty than the slow collapse of a nervous system. Every function still operated, orders issued, reports received, ceremonies performed, but none connected to anything human. What had once been a temple of pain now became an industry. The honey chambers had multiplied, metastasized. The original 9 were now 27, an underground city of suffering stretching beneath Memphis, like the roots of a poisoned tree. The new annexes were carved deeper into limestone corridors lined with glazed tiles to reflect torchlight in perpetual shimmer. They bore names that no language had carried before: the Chamber of Renewal, the Mouth of Dawn, the Room of Separated Voices. Each title disguised purpose beneath theology. Where the early rituals had been individual, one victim, one audience, the late years became orchestration. Multiple sessions ran simultaneously, the screams merging into a constant vibration that pulsed through the floors. Servants said it was like living inside a beehive, the air warm, the sound endless, the sweetness unbearable. Pepi called it the symphony of divine instruction. Too feeble to walk, he was carried between chambers on a golden litter by 4 eunuchs. He moved from room to room as if inspecting production lines, and pausing briefly to issue adjustments. More venom, extend, it's the chant. Bring in the twins together. Each command entered the ledgers, cross-referenced, analysed, improved. Every chamber had its own overseer, its own scribes and healers. Their reports flowed upward to the central archive tables of endurance. Time's voice decibel charts cost analyses of insects and wax tablets estimating divine output. The machine no longer needed belief to run. It ran because it was habit, because hundreds of lives depended on its continuation. The carpenters who built the restraints, the potters who fired insect jars, the scribes who copied data, all of them were part of an economy that had forgotten its origin. The honey chambers had become Egypt's only sable institution. But the procurement system, the fragile pipeline that fed this empire of torment, was dying. The provinces were empty. There were no boys left to take. The overseer of royal entertainments reported increasing difficulty in sourcing appropriate offerings. In truth, the scouts had become raiders. At dawn, palace guards now rode out like predators. They no longer carried temple seals or honeyed words, only torches and ropes. Villages awoke to hoofbeats, dogs barking and smoke. Men who resisted were slaughtered, their wives bound to watch. The surviving boys were lined up, measured, roughly chained by necks in pairs, and marched north. Those too young or too old to fit the criteria were killed on the spot to prevent pursuit. A fragmentary papyrus buried by a terrified scribe describes one such raid. They came with the rising light 20 soldiers in bronze. They took every boy who could run, and when the mothers threw themselves before them, they poured honey on the women's faces, so that the insects might silence their cries. They left the village smoking. We buried what remained when night returned. These were not isolated incidents. They were policy. The court euphemized them as direct acquisition. When governors protested, Pepi ordered their families seized. When provinces ran dry, soldiers ventured into foreign lands, raiding Nubian hamlets and Libyan oases, dragging captives across deserts. The very borders of Egypt dissolved, replaced by zones of harvest and waste. Memphis, once the radiant heart of civilization, became a necropolis of motion. Caravans of chains arrived daily. The courtyards filled with cages. The priests turned away, the guards marched on. The river itself grew foul. Fishermen complained of oily residue from the chamber's runoff, bits of wax, traces of honey human ash, carried downstream into the delta. The Nile lifeblood of Egypt had become the pharaoh's sewer. Inside the palace, the old hierarchies collapsed into madness. The overseer of royal entertainments was executed for failing to meet quotas. His replacement lasted a month. By the fourth successor, the title had lost meaning. Orders contradicted each other. Records blurred. Sometimes 2 caravans would arrive the same day with the same boys, both claiming the same village. No one corrected it. The machine consumed duplication as easily as flesh. Meanwhile, the population of Memphis thinned. Workers fled under cover of night. Families vanished into the western desert, choosing thirst over proximity to the chambers. But the palace continued as if nothing had changed. Each morning the eunuchs carried Pepi through the honeyed corridors. Each evening they washed his hands in scented oil. The air reeked of incense and death. The scale defied imagination. Witnesses who later fled described 27 rooms functioning in cycles each chamber, with a different rhythm so that the noise never ceased. When one ritual paused, another began. The cries overlapped into something neither human nor divine, a continuous low moan that resonated through the limestone. Guards claimed they could feel it in their teeth. Physicians stuffed their ears with wax. Pepi insisted that the vibration was sacred. He grew translucent with age, his skin parchment, his veins like faded hieroglyphs beneath the surface. Yet his hunger sharpened. He demanded rarities, twins foreigners, children of nobles. His attendants scoured what remained of the population, competing to offer novelty. The concept of blasphemy evaporated. The pharaoh's fascination was the only law. By now the rest of Egypt no longer functioned as a state. The temples silent, the farms dust, the markets bare. Only the palace still produced its product was suffering. The guards themselves, half-starved, guarded the chambers with mechanical devotion, their pay sipped in honey instead of coin. Some went mad, smearing themselves with it, mumbling prayers to invisible bees. The city around them turned grey and still. Smoke hung perpetually over Memphis, the residue of burned villages drifting north. The courtyards where musicians once played filled with crows. The palace artisans painted murals of abundance while rats gnawed at their ankles. This was the industrialization of darkness, ritual, turned into routine horror, mechanized until even the executioners forgot why they worked. Egypt had reached the point where its last remaining efficiency was pain, and through it all the old man on the litter smiled faintly, carried from chamber to chamber, eyes half-lidded, listening to his eternal symphony. He believed himself immortal. He believed Egypt still obeyed him, and in a way it did. Every scream was proof. Outside, beyond the crumbling walls, The desert was already reclaiming the canals, the roads, the empty towns. The wind began its patient work, bearing the harvest of bones beneath sand. The empire was dying exactly as it had lived slowly, systematically, sweetly. It was not conquest that ended Egypt. It was exhaustion. A civilization that had spent a century perfecting the art of death had finally run out of life to feed it. The night had become permanent and its machinery hummed on. The final record of Pepi II's reign begins fittingly with a fragment half-burned ink blurred by heat and panic. It was written by a palace guard named Nebra, found centuries later, sealed in the wall of a worker's hut near Saqqara. What remains is less a report than a confession 40 chosen for Zo, the Ishnine night work. New jars opened, creatures bred too long in the dark. Mixtures of resin and gall that blistered the air before touching skin. The priests wore linen masks, the pharaoh laughed. I saw the floor move like water. We were told the gods demanded renewal. The fragment ends mid-sentence as if its author dropped his stylus when the torches failed. From what can be reconstructed, the last session was no ritual, but an implosion. A final experiment in sensation pushed past sanity. The insects were described as larger than the hand-pail from long confinement. The substances that should not touch flesh were likely alchemical slurries of venom and fermenting honey, their fumes enough to sear lungs. The 40 boys were brought in together, a scale never attempted before. Each was restrained upright so that the pharaoh, too frail to rise from his litter, could see them all at once. The accounts say he ordered the chambers sealed from within to contain the holiness. What happened next, no scribe recorded in full. Those who survived the outer corridors spoke of a roar, not human, not animal, but the sound of boiling honey igniting. The limestone shook. Smoke bled through the cracks in the floor. By dawn the palace smelled of burned sweetness and iron. When the guards finally forced the doors open, the air inside was so thick with vapour that torches went out. The floor was slick, the walls alive with movement ants, wasps, beetles in endless convulsion devouring one another. Of the victims nothing whole remained, and in the centre on the raised platform the pharaoh sat slumped in his litter, eyes open, lips drawn into what witnesses called a smile. His right hand held a fragment of honeycomb. His left still gripped the armrest nails sunk into gold. He had died sometime in the night without struggle, as if listening to the final crescendo of his own creation. When the physicians touched his body, they found his mouth crusted with sweetness, his tongue black. The last taste of his life was the thing that had defined it, but the machine he built did not die with him. For 3 days the chambers continued to run on habit. The guards maintained patrols, the scribes copied reports, the physicians tended survivors who no longer existed. No one dared proclaim the pharaoh dead. To do so might break the spell that held their world together. Honey still flowed in, scent still burned, and the torches were kept alight as though awaiting command. On the 4th dawn, decomposition began to announce the truth. Flies swarmed the throne room, drawn by a sweetness too strong to mask. The eunuchs who had carried him collapsed where they stood, overcome by heat and guilt. Only then did someone whisper the forbidden words, "The god is gone." What followed was not revolution, but paralysis. The priests refused to touch the body, the guards refused to bury it. Servants fled into the desert, some carrying jars of honey as currency, others setting fire to archives to erase what they had seen. The great mechanism, 9 decades of precision cruelty, seized in a single instant. Doors meant to open by ritual key jammed forever. Clay seals hardened, torches burned down to puddles of wax. By nightfall, the sound that had filled Memphis for generations, the continuous hum of suffering, fell silent. The chambers were sealed whether by fear or reverence, no one knows. And above them the city lay in stillness so profound that those who survived swore they could hear the river breathing again. In the end, Pepi II achieved what he had pursued all his life, absolute stillness, perfect control. But it was not divinity that granted it, only exhaustion. The man who had turned pain into system, who had demanded that sweetness conquer death, became another layer of the honeyed stone he built. 3 days after the last session, Egypt had no ruler, no army, no sons. Only bees remained circling the sealed vents of the chambers, confused by the scent that once guided them. The machine had outlived its master for the length of a single breath. Then, like a hive without a queen, it simply stopped moving. The moment Pepi's breath ceased, Memphis erupted, not in mourning but in panic. There was no proclamation, no ceremony. The court understood instantly that the pharaoh's death was not a transition of power, it was an emergency. A god could not die without taking his world with him. The overseers, the priests, the guards, they all knew what had to be done, not to honour him, but to survive him. And so within hours, the city that had served him for 90 years began to eat its own memory. The bonfires came first. In the courtyards of the palace, scribes piled their own work into heaps: scrolls, ledgers, ritual manuals, procurement lists, anatomical diagrams, even the sacred records of the priests. The air filled with the hiss of burning papyrus, the crackle of honey jars tossed into the flames. It was not organised erasure, it was frenzy. Men threw in documents they did not understand, terrified that the wrong ink might one day condemn them. Others tried to rescue their own names, tearing signatures from decrees before consigning the rest to the fire. For 3 days and nights the sky above Memphis glowed orange. The city smelled of sweet smoke and salt papyrus resin and ink mingling with panic. Witnesses later said it felt like watching Egypt burn itself clean, as if knowledge itself were contagious. The walls came next. Chisels rang out in the palace halls and temple courtyards. Stonemasons, half-starved and shaking, climbed scaffolds to gouge hieroglyphs from the reliefs. Everywhere Pepi's name appeared, it was obliterated. Every scene showing his likeness was scraped to faceless ruin. It was as though the empire had decided that if it could not undo his crimes, it would at least unwrite them. The priest called it purification by silence. They told the workers that to leave his image intact was to invite his return. Yet the truth was simpler. They feared that history itself might still serve him if left whole. In the honey chambers, the purge took a darker form. Those who dared enter found walls slick with residue and floors that pulsed with the echo of trapped air. The decision came quickly: seal everything. The surviving attendants herded the remaining subjects, the broken, half-blind boys who had been kept alive for further sessions, into the dormitories. They whispered prayers as they closed the doors, promising the children safety. Then they bricked them in. No one wanted to hear what followed. The sounds were muffled by the thickness of the walls, by the chanting of priests who recited over the construction as if building a tomb. By morning the corridors were silent again. Above, the courtiers fought to decide what to do with the pharaoh's body. The priests of Anubis, bound by ritual, should have prepared his corpse for the afterlife, but none would touch him. They claimed his ka, his life force, was corrupted beyond purification. So the task fell to a handful of embalmers under armed guard. They worked not in reverence, but in vengeance. The corpse was stripped of its gold wrappings. The sacred organs, heart, lungs, liver, were not preserved, but dissolved in quicklime. The canopic jars were left empty, their inscriptions smeared with pitch. Instead of the resins meant to preserve, they packed the body with salts that corroded with sand and insects still alive. They wrapped him backwards, feet where the head should be, ensuring he would never find his way to paradise. One scribe's marginal note survives. He sought eternity and sweetness. We give him rot instead. Even the pyramid, his monument to divinity, was turned into a weapon of forgetting. The architects, weary of decades spent building for a monster, obeyed the new command: complete it, but make it mortal. They used inferior limestone from quarries long abandoned. The mortar was thinned with brine so it would crumble. Support beams were misaligned by inches enough to guarantee eventual collapse. Inside, false corridors were filled with sand to destabilize the foundation. And in the burial chamber, the sarcophagus was placed directly beneath the ceiling, deliberately too heavy to hold. When it cracked, and it did within a century, the weight of the stone above shattered the coffin and crushed the mummy within. It was architecture as exorcism. Egypt had learned to build its revenge not with rebellion, but with time. Outside the pyramid, the funerary texts were altered, where previous kings' tombs bore hymns of ascent. Rise, O sun, and cross the sky. Pepi's walls spoke only of descent. He returns to the depths. He will not rise again. Each line an incantation to bind him below. Memphis itself followed suit. The surviving administrators shut down the honey industry, slaughtered the sacred hives, and ordered the bees burned in their wax. Honey became taboo. Markets purged it from offerings. Families whispered old warnings. Sweetness hides sin. The once bustling warehouses fell silent, their clay jars sealed with tar. The scent lingered for years, a ghost that refused to fade. And yet beneath all that destruction, traces remained. Even as the walls were erased, the memories persisted in whispers of screams, at night of fires that smelled like sugar, of the pharaoh whose heart turned the colour of honey. But no chronicler dared record his name again. On the few surviving tablets from the following reign, the formula for time itself changes. Instead of year 1 after the reign of Pepi II, it reads simply year 1 of renewal. The empire had not recovered, it had amputated. Egypt's last act of unity was to destroy its own history, to bury the disease so deep that no future king would ever dare dig there again. And so the fires burned out, the chisels went silent, and the sand began its slow work of mercy. The dormitories sealed with the living, the tomb filled with salt, the pyramid engineered to fall. A god had died, and the world he built was dying with him grain by grain, as though the desert itself had decided to erase his name. When the last worker left Saqqara, he turned once to look back at the pyramid, its edges already softening under wind. He said, or someone imagined he said, "May it crumble faster than the time it took to build." It did. Within a century the ceiling collapsed. Within 1,000 years the name was dust. Only the silence remained and the faintest sweetness in the sand. When Pepi's corpse finally crumbled under its own monument, the empire he ruled had already ceased to exist. His death did not end Egypt, it exposed that it had ended long before. What followed was not conquest, not rebellion, but vacuum. A vast, slow unravelling, where even decay lost structure. Within months, the apparatus of the state, so intricate, so proud, collapsed under its own weight. The irrigation canals, once maintained, with clockwork precision, silted over. Without the seasonal dredging teams of able-bodied men, boys grown into fathers, who never came to be the Nile flooded wrong. Some regions drowned, others went dry. The lifeline of the kingdom became a web of stagnant pools breeding fever and despair. The scribes who had once mapped every rise of the river stopped recording. Their ink dried mid-line, their ledgers half empty, their quills abandoned on the stone desks. The archives burned in Memphis had been the mind of the state. Now that mind was gone. The bureaucracy that once kept Egypt alive through famine and flood was blind. Tax collectors arrived to find empty villages. Temple granaries once overflowing were looted or deserted. When the treasury sent couriers demanding tribute, they returned with silence or not at all. The roads themselves disintegrated. Caravan routes shifted east toward the Levant, bypassing Egyptian ports. Foreign traders avoided the lower Nile altogether, preferring new paths through the Sinai. Maps that once placed Egypt at the centre of the world began drawing it as margin, a ghost shore haunted by memories of wealth. Those who still lived there bartered in whispers, surviving on whatever the river gave back. The intellectual heart of the empire scattered, the priesthood decimated by purges and starvation fractured into local cults, each rewriting the gods to suit their own ruins. In some towns, Ra became a river spirit again. In others, Osiris was blamed for betrayal. The common people cut off from organised faith turned to old, half-forgotten deities of the floodplain shrines, to stones, trees and ancestors. Civilization had cracked back into fragments of belief. Language itself began to stutter. The formal hieroglyphs of Memphis fell out of use. Too few scribes remained to teach them. Within a generation, the writing of the state became a mystery even to its own descendants. Clay tablets gave way to scratched symbols on pottery, local dialects diverged, or oral legends replaced records. The very knowledge that had once bound Egypt into eternity atomized into dust. What the honeyed tyranny had destroyed was not just bodies but succession. The demographic wound ripened into a century of barrenness. Those missing boys would have become farmers, soldiers, artisans and fathers. Their absence hollowed time itself. In villages spared the raids, the imbalance was visible everywhere. Too many old men, too many widows, too many daughters with no husbands. The rhythm of life seed growth harvest had been broken at its human root. The fields lay untended because no one could lift the plough. The shrines fell silent because no one remembered the chants. The houses echoed with women's songs for sons who had never been born. Census stelae from later dynasties show the scar clearly, a missing generation stretching across decades, an unnatural gap where population should have risen. Archaeologists would call it the long demographic winter. To those who lived it, it felt like haunted stillness, the sense that the world had miscounted itself and could never recover the lost number. And absence, once measured only in flesh, began to infect imagination. Children grew up among ruins asking who had lived there, and their elders could not answer. In the northern provinces, people stopped naming their sons after ancestors. Too many names belonged to the taken. In the south, entire family lines ended without ceremony, their tombs collapsing into sand before anyone could offer rites. Even in places untouched by the pharaoh's reach, the grief persisted like a drought. The Nile flowed, but no one trusted it. The seasons returned, but no one planted with hope. Farmers tilled fields out of habit as though repeating gestures for gods they no longer believed in. From the Delta to Elephantine Egypt became a mosaic of empty spaces. Canals without water, homes without laughter, temples without priests. Trade shrank to barter literacy, to rumour faith, to superstition. The once living body of the state stiffened into legend. In later centuries, poets of the Middle Kingdom would romanticize this interval as the Great Silence, a time when the river forgot its name. But the truth was not poetic, it was arithmetic. The empire had lost the generation that carries memory. With them vanished skill continuity and love's repetition. The irony was merciless. Pepi had built his empire on the study of pain, convinced that knowledge could be extracted from suffering. But when he died, his legacy proved the opposite. Pain does not teach, it erases. His machine of cruelty had annihilated the very capacity to remember, leaving behind only emptiness, efficient, complete, irreversible. In that vacuum, time itself seemed to hesitate. The sun still rose, the flood still came, but Egypt had no centre left to greet them. The absence had conquered everything: grain, language, lineage, even the will to record. A civilization that once measured eternity now measured only loss. And across the silent fields the wind carried the faint sweetness of buried honey, the last scent of an empire that had eaten its own future. History is full of predators who believe themselves divine. Every empire at some point breeds one. The Roman Emperor Tiberius withdrew to the cliffs of Capri, where the Mediterranean crashed against limestone and secrecy. There his gardens became theatres of appetite. He surrounded himself with children trained to please him, minnows he called them, and those who aged beyond his interest were thrown from the cliffs to join Neptune. The Senate murmured. The people whispered, yet Rome continued to function. For 23 years Tiberius ruled insulated by fear and distance. In 15th century France, the nobleman Gilles de Rais, hero of the wars beside Joan of Arc, retired to his chateau to pursue experiments of the soul. He lured peasant boys with pageantry, promising apprenticeship, and performed unspeakable rites before their deaths. When he was finally tried, the records filled volumes. He was executed within a decade of his first crimes. A century later in the Carpathians, the Countess Elizabeth Bathory hunted immortality through blood. In the frozen courtyards of her fortress, servant girls were stripped, drained, and dissected under the pretext of alchemy. She reigned over horror for 20 years before her relatives locked her behind her own walls to die. Each of these names Tiberius de Rais Bathory casts a long shadow. Yet all are flickers beside Pepi II. Their depravity burned swiftly, his endured like geology. 90+ years, 9 decades without interruption. He ruled longer than many civilizations last, and every day of that rule was spent refining the machinery of pain. The difference was not appetite but architecture. Where others indulged secrecy, Pepi institutionalized desire. His was not the whim of a madman in a villa, it was policy. Tiberius needed privacy. Pepi built infrastructure. De Rais depended on accomplices. Pepi required an empire. Bathory bathed in blood for vanity. Pepi did so for data. He transformed cruelty into bureaucracy, converting ritual into routine until the line between devotion and depravity vanished. His priests blessed his experiments, his physicians refined them, his scribes recorded them, and his farmers sustained them. A whole civilization became his laboratory. The Roman Senate could gossip about Tiberius, but Egypt's Council of Nobles worshipped Pepi. French bishops condemned de Rais, but Pepi's priests called his atrocities divine exploration. The villagers who whispered about Bathory could flee her castle. Pepi's subjects could flee nowhere, for his power was the horizon itself. What makes Pepi singular is not that he was monstrous. Monsters are easy to imagine, but that his monstrosity was ordinary. It functioned by schedule, it had accountants, it paid wages, it issued reports. The honey chambers did not operate in chaos. They followed a calendar more precise than the Nile's flood. The procurement networks, the breeding programs for insects, the temples that blessed shipments, all formed a lattice of obedience, so stable that even Pepi's death could not immediately stop it. His cruelty was not an eruption of madness, but the steady hum of administration. That is why later ages would struggle to believe it. Historians are trained to find patterns to fit horror into the familiar. They point to Tiberius, to de Rais, to Bathory, and say this too. But Pepi's reign does not rhyme, it drones. He is not an episode, he is a process. He demonstrated how long a society can sustain atrocity when it calls it sacred. How paper and ink temples and taxes can become tools of slow annihilation. How people who would never raise a weapon can destroy the world by filing reports. Modernity pretends the lesson is distant, that bureaucracy protects us from chaos. But Pepi's Egypt shows the opposite bureaucracy is capable of perfect evil precisely because it obeys its own logic. Once a system divorces action from empathy, cruelty becomes just another task completed, another quota met. Tiberius fell to paranoia, Darius to trial, Bathory to scandal, Pepi to entropy. No rebellion ended him, no judgment, no divine lightning. His empire decayed not because it repented, but because it exhausted its supply of lives to consume. That exhaustion is the purest verdict history ever delivered. It tells us that atrocity can sustain itself for a lifetime, even for a century, but not forever. There comes a moment when the machine runs out of bodies, when silence overtakes command, when the absence it created turns back and devours its master. In that sense, Pepi II stands not as an exception to human cruelty, but as its blueprint proof that when power persists too long without accountability, it will build its own theology of harm and call it order. He was the patient zero of systemic monstrosity, a man who proved that evil to endure must first become administration, and that once it does, it can wear any name, pharaoh, emperor, noble, countess, CEO, and still hum the same tune. For 94 years, Egypt's hum was sweetness and screaming intertwined, and when it finally stopped, the silence was not redemption, only the sound of a machine too empty to move. The torches are gone, the chambers are dust. The air that once trembled with sound is still, yet if you press your ear to the stone, the silence hums. It is not the echo of screams, it is the aftersound of a civilization learning nothing. Somewhere beneath the ruins of Saqqara lies a room the archaeologists still avoid naming. It has no inscriptions, no idols, no treasure. Only walls streaked with something that once ran warm. In that room once there was a boy. No records mention him. His name was never carved, his lineage never traced. Yet he is the loudest silence history ever made. All that remains of him is the shape of his absence, the missing generations that followed, the villages erased from maps, the rivers silted with memory. He was one among thousands, but in him unnamed, unburied, unremembered. The sum of Egypt's achievement collapsed into a question. Because the lesson of Pepi II was never about the scale of cruelty, it was about the structure that allowed it, the machinery of obedience, the comfort of routine, the way paper can bless violence, and how precision can replace conscience. We like to think distance absolves us, that bureaucracy is ancient, that ritualized harm belongs to empires of stone, but the pattern persists, modern, polished, efficient. Procurement chains that turn forests into statistics, villages into zones, bodies into samples, euphemisms that translate cruelty into policy, containment, correction, cleansing, languages that call harm data collection, that rename hunger, shortage that disguise displacement as relocation, and always evidence that disappears. Every age invents its own honey chambers, though they look cleaner now, fluorescent lit instead of torchlit, justified by science instead of faith, supervised by algorithms instead of priests. The methods change, the architecture endures. Cruelty once made procedural learns immortality. That is why the quiet historians refuse spectacle. They sift ash and whisper through dust, not to shock, but to recognize. They look for the nameless boy, not because they expect to find him, but because finding him is what keeps civilization human. Each recovered bone, each erased inscription, each unfiled record is a warning disguised as archaeology. History's verdict is never a shout. It is a held breath between facts, the realization that systems built to serve can learn to feed that devotion, can harden into doctrine, that power without expiry becomes theology. The most dangerous empires are not those that love conquest, but those that forget to stop. Pepi's Egypt is gone, but the logic that birthed it still moves quietly through boardrooms, ministries, laboratories. The words have changed, but the tone remains optimization, standardization, efficiency. The hum of progress has always risked turning into the hum of obedience. So the verdict is not about Egypt, it is about us. Every civilization must decide how long it allows any one will divine corporate ideological to define its truth. Every citizen must learn to hear the difference between devotion and submission. Every historian, quiet or otherwise, must guard the threshold where explanation becomes excuse. The boy in the chamber cannot speak. The empire that built him cannot apologize. But we can choose what his silence means. We can let it fade into myth, another tragedy in the long museum of horror. Or we can treat it as instruction that the first duty of a humane society is not wealth or order, but vigilance against euphemism, against permanence, against the comfort of obedience. There must always be limits on power, on duration, on what we call necessity, because unchecked time breeds belief, and belief untested becomes worship, and worship unbounded becomes the honeyed mask of atrocity. So remember him, the boy without name, the silence that hums beneath Memphis. Remember him when language softens violence, when paperwork replaces faces, when systems ask for trust in exchange for oversight. Remember him when history feels too distant to matter, because memory is not nostalgia, it is maintenance. It is the act that keeps a culture from turning its gaze away. In the end, the empire fell, but its pulse remains beneath our skin. The question it leaves is the same one that should begin every new century. When cruelty becomes normal, who will notice first, the victims or the historians? And if it must be the historians, may they never again be quiet. The Honeyed Mirror. Lessons from an empire that devoured itself. History's most disturbing stories do not merely describe cruelty, they reflect the quiet mechanics that allow it. The tale of Pepi II, the child pharaoh who reigned for nearly a century, is less about a monster than about a system that built him. Behind the torches, honey and insects lay something chillingly familiar, an empire that confused obedience with virtue and routine with morality. Its lesson still stands not as distant horror but as a mirror. The first truth it reveals is that evil rarely begins as spectacle. It begins as structure. A meeting, a memo, a rule written to make someone's life easier by making another's invisible. Pepi's Egypt perfected that logic. Suffering was standardized, catalogued and blessed. In our world, the same pattern hides in the language of bureaucracy, technology and policy. We rename cruelty calling it efficiency, optimization or security. The form changes, the function remains, the lesson is vigilance. Whenever a rule demands obedience without empathy, history whispers that we are rehearsing an old script. The second lesson is about the danger of duration. Power that lasts too long begins to believe itself eternal. Pepi's 9-decade reign shows that unchecked time can turn authority into theology. The same can happen in families, corporations or governments when a single will endures without challenge. Empathy erodes, curiosity dies, and cruelty becomes convenience. The antidote is renewal limits, term ends, fresh voices. Life thrives on rotation. Stagnation breeds gods. Third silence is complicity, not safety. The priests, officials and farmers who sustained Pepi's machine were not sadists, they were obedient. They kept their heads down, filed their reports and told themselves that someone else was responsible. Their compliance built the chambers as surely as the masons did. We often imagine courage as dramatic defiance, but history proves it is quieter. The refusal to participate, the insistence on seeing what others choose not to see. The fourth lesson is memory as moral maintenance. Egypt tried to erase Pepi, burned records, collapsed. His pyramids sealed his victims in stone. Yet forgetting did not heal. It merely postponed learning. The same is true today. Societies that bury their shame repeat it. Remembering is not obsession, it is prevention. We honour the nameless by refusing to let their pain disappear into data. Finally, the story teaches humility before power. Civilization's achievements, its monuments, its hierarchies, its rituals can be turned against it when compassion is removed from the design. The same intelligence that builds medicine, law or technology can build instruments of harm if left unexamined. Wisdom is not in invention, it is in restraint. So the boy covered in honey becomes more than a victim of antiquity. He becomes a sentinel for conscience, a reminder that every society must choose again and again between comfort and humanity. Our tools are sharper, our systems faster, but the question has not changed. Will we notice the next chamber before it is built? Because civilization is always one act of silence away from repeating Egypt's sweetest, darkest mistake. Thank you so much for keeping me company tonight. Don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more stories together.